Clipper Audiobooks presents A Maiden's Voyage by Rosie Goodwin, narrated by Charlie Sanderson. This book is in loving memory of Philip Howells, 20th of January 1933 to 17th of July 2018. A dear uncle and a very brave man. Rest in peace. Thursday's child has far to go. Prologue. December 1911. Oh, do hurry up. Father will be home soon. He took his dinner suit to the office with him so he could get changed there, and you know he'll be impatient to be off. Yes, miss. 18-year-old Flora was suddenly all fingers and thumbs as she tried to pile her young mistress's hair on top of her head in loose curls. But the faster she tried to do it, the more the curls escaped. Constance's, or Connie as she preferred to be known, wild tresses seemed to have developed a life of their own. Connie had only recently adopted this style, saying that it was more sophisticated and made her look older, but Flora hadn't mastered the art of getting it quite right yet. "It's just that you have so much hair," she muttered through a mouthful of pins. Connie grinned at her in the mirror of her dressing table. "You're a fine one to talk," she said. And she was right, for Flora's hair was just as long and thick as her own, although not quite so curly. In fact, the girls were very similar in looks in many ways. They were both of much the same height and build, with long dark hair, but where Connie had deep blue eyes, Flora's were a warm brown colour. They were very close in age, too. Connie had just celebrated her 18th birthday, while Flora would be 19 the following March. Connie supposed that was why she had managed to persuade her father to let Flora be promoted from general maid to her own personal maid, and she had never regretted it. It was nice to have someone her own age to help with her dressing and act as her companion. Since Flora had taken on the role, it had afforded Connie a lot more freedom. Her father didn't mind her going out so much if Flora escorted her, whereas before he had always worried if she were to go out on her own. "There, I think that's it," Flora breathed suddenly as she jammed yet another hair clip into the mass of springy curls. "What do you think, miss?" Connie turned her head this way and that, then smiled. "I suppose that will do nicely. I think you're getting the hang of it. But come along, I need to get dressed." She rose from the dressing table and moved across to the armoire that stood against the far wall of her bedroom, where the gown she'd had especially made for the occasion was hanging. She fingered the smooth cream silk and asked, "Do you think Father will approve?" "I don't see how he couldn't, miss," Flora said enviously. "How he couldn't, not 'ow." Connie absently corrected her, and Flora sighed. Connie had been giving her elocution lessons ever since the day she had appointed her as her maid, but she still tended to forget herself from time to time. While Connie stood in front of the mirror, Flora began the difficult job of lacing up her corset. "Pull it tighter," Connie instructed. "I want my waist to look really tiny." "If I pull it any tighter, you won't be able to breathe," Flora pointed out. Connie supposed she was right, so she stood quietly while Flora lowered the gown over her head, careful not to mess her hair, and fastened the buttons at the back. Finally, Flora helped her slip her feet into dainty satin shoes. It was to be Connie's first trip to the opera with her father, and she had gone to endless trouble to make sure that her outfit was just right, although Flora was a little concerned how the shoes would fare outside. It had been snowing steadily all day. But then she supposed that Connie couldn't wear boots beneath such an elegant gown, and she did only have to go down the steps and straight into her father's gleaming new Rolls-Royce after all. At last, the girl was ready, and turning to Flora in a swish of silken skirts, she asked, "So how do I look?" "Beautiful," Flora answered truthfully, wondering what Connie's father would think of the plunging neckline on her dress. She did indeed look very grown up. "Right then, I'll go downstairs and wait for Father." Connie snatched up a dainty satin evening purse and a fur-lined cape and headed for the door, where she paused to say, "Do take the night off if you want to, Flora. You've more than enough time to go and see your family if you don't mind braving the weather. I doubt we'll be back before 11 o'clock at the earliest." "Thank you, miss." Flora bobbed her knee and set about tidying the room. There were clothes and underwear strewn about all over the place, but she was used to it by now. Connie liked to be waited on and was not the tidiest of people. Downstairs, she heard the general maid opening the front door, and she rightly guessed that it was Mr. Ogilvy, Connie's father, returning home after a day at his office. He owned a number of warehouses in Whitechapel, as well as a fleet of boats that imported goods from abroad, and it was rumoured that he was one of the richest men in London. Flora had never had any reason to doubt it, for his townhouse was situated in one of the richest areas of Mayfair, and Connie had had every advantage a young woman could possibly have: private tutors, a nanny, and beautiful clothes. She had never known what it was like to be cold and hungry as Flora had, but for all that, she didn't envy her. Her family lived in a poor part of Whitechapel, and her father was reliant on getting work daily on the docks unloading the boats that came in. If he didn't get work one day, they didn't eat. It was as simple as that. Yet for all that, they were happy. Unlike Connie, who, Flora had realised within a very short time of working there, was desperately lonely. The girl's mother had died while she was still very young, but before she died, she had coldly informed the child that she was adopted and that she had never really wanted her. Poor Connie had been heartbroken and had never really recovered from these cruel words. Thankfully, though, her father doted on her and spoiled her shamelessly. But he had a busy job, so after her adoptive mother's death, Connie had been left in the care of a number of tutors and nannies who came and went. Flora hurriedly finished tidying the room. It wasn't often she was given some unexpected time off, and she intended to make the most of the next few hours. Once everything was neatly put away, she threw some coal onto the fire, so that the room would still be warm when Connie returned, then hurried away to fetch her hat and coat. Much to her delight, she now slept in the room next to Connie's, which was not only much nicer, but was also warmer than the chilly room she had slept in up in the servants' quarters in the attic when she had first started there. In no time at all, she was wrapped up warmly, and once down in the hall she smiled at Gertie, the little general maid, who was flitting in and out of the dining room, laying the table in readiness for Connie and her father's breakfast the next morning. "Off out, are you?" Gertie raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Miss Connie said I could have a few hours off seeing as she was going out." Gertie shuddered. "Well, rather you than me. It's enough to freeze the hairs off a brass monkey out there." Flora laughed as she stepped out into the snow, then gasped as the cold almost took her breath away. Gertie was right, but there was no way she was going to waste the chance of a few precious hours at home. Hopefully, she would be able to take a tram most of the way there if she got her skates on. That's if the snow hadn't stopped them running. Thankfully, as yet it hadn't, and half an hour later she stepped off the tram close to the workhouse in Whitechapel. Averting her eyes from the grim building, she made for the back streets that would lead to Pleasant Row, where her family lived. The name always made her smile, for the rows of tiny, damp, soot-blackened terraced houses were anything but pleasant. They were all exactly the same, with front doors that opened directly onto the street. In the winter, the houses were bitterly cold, and in the summer, stiflingly hot. Tonight, black icicles hung from the window frames and the eaves. Even so, it was the only place she had ever called home, and soon she walked into the tiny kitchen. Flora's eyes swept around the familiar room. Gas mantles spluttered on the walls, and an oil lamp spread a warm glow across the table that stood in the centre of the room. On the wall, next to the table, stood an old oak dresser, displaying her mother's mismatched but much-loved china, and brightly coloured rugs, which her mother had spent countless hours making, were scattered across the floor. Her mother, Emily, turned from the stove where she was stirring a pot of stew for the family, and swiped a lock of hair from her eyes, looking surprised but pleased to see her. "What are you doing here, lovey?" Then the smile faded as she whispered fearfully, "You ain't got the sack, have you?" She'd come to rely on the wages that Flora gave her each month. Flora giggled as she removed her bonnet and crossed to warm her hands by the fire. "No, Ma, I haven't got the sack. Connie has gone to the opera with her father tonight, so she gave me a few hours off, and I thought I'd pop home to see you all." Well, lovely as it is to see you, I reckon you'd have been better staying in the warm." Emily glanced towards the window, through which she could see the snow still steadily falling, and shuddered. "But now you're here, pull up a chair and come and have something to eat." Flora shook her head as she bent to plant a kiss on Timmy's head. At 5 years old, he was the baby of the family, and Flora adored him. "Thanks, but I've already eaten," she assured her mother. She knew that any stew that was left over from this evening would have more vegetables added to it and be served up again the next day, and she didn't want to deprive them of it. Emily smiled. "Hey, you don't half talk posh now since you went to work for that young lady," she commented proudly. "I try to." Then, glancing about, Flora asked, "Where's Dad?" "Still at work unloading a big cargo ship that docked this morning." As Emily served herself a small portion of stew and carried it to the table, Flora noticed how tired she looked. People often told her that she looked just like her mother had at her age, but worry and overwork had prematurely aged her, and now she looked like a woman in her 50s rather than one who was only in her early 40s. There were streaks of grey in her hair, and her face was lined. But for all that, she was still attractive, and Flora loved her unreservedly. Shortly after, Katie, Flora's 16-year-old sister, breezed in, having just finished her shift in the match factory. She was followed not long after by her brother, Ben, who was 17 and working with his father on the docks. Then came Eunice, the bookworm of the family, who was 15 and had found herself a job in the city in a small bookshop, which she loved. And finally, there was little Timmy. There had been 3 more children, but they had all died in the flu epidemic that had swept through the city a few years ago. Looking back, Flora realised that her mother had never really got over losing them, but she had struggled gamely on, as most women from hereabouts had to. "So, how come you didn't go see your young man then?" Emily asked, with a twinkle in her eye. Flora blushed. "If you're talking about Jamie, I didn't know that I was going to get any time off until the last minute, so there was no time to make arrangements with him." She and Jamie had met back in the summer, after he'd come to London from Nuneaton, a small market town in the Midlands, to find work. They had hit it off straight away, and had been seeing each other every Sunday afternoon ever since. Jamie was such a lovely person, and Flora knew that she would only have to say the word, and she could be planning her wedding. But she wasn't sure she was ready to settle down just yet. Because, much as she had come to love him, there was no hurry. She and Jamie had their whole lives ahead of them, so why should they rush? She didn't want to be like the other girls from these parts who ended up marrying when they were too young, having a baby every year, and becoming old before their time. Oh no, Flora had ambitions. Wasn't she already a lady's maid? But she wasn't going to tell her mother that, so instead she continued teasingly. "Why, would you rather I'd have gone to see him than come here to see you?" "Of course I wouldn't, you daft apeth." Her mother grinned. "But anyone with half an eye can see the lad's mad about you. When are you going to put him out of his misery and agree to court him proper?" Flora grinned, but didn't answer. She loved Jamie, and she knew he loved her, but she was only 18. Once the meal was over, she helped her mother to clear the table and wash the dishes, and before she knew it, it was time to think of heading home. "Hey, but it's blowing a blizzard out there, lovey. Wouldn't you be better to stay here tonight?" her mother suggested worriedly, as Flora began to put her coat on. "No, I shall be fine," Flora assured her. "I need to be there when Connie gets home to help her undress." "I should think she could manage to undress herself for one night at her age," Emily grumbled, as she tightened the scarf around her daughter's neck. There were kisses all round then, and Flora set off again into the cold night. As she neared the smart townhouse in Mayfair, she frowned when she saw a policeman standing outside the front door. The snow was settling on his helmet, and the dark material across his shoulders. She climbed the front steps towards him and asked, "Is anything wrong, Constable?" Close up, she noted that he looked barely older than herself, and he blushed furiously. He touched his cap and cleared his throat nervously.
The sergeant's inside, miss," he told her. "He'll explain what's happened."
A sick feeling started to grow in the pit of her stomach, and nodding, she rushed past him to find a policeman in conversation with Mrs. Merry, the housekeeper, who was wringing her hands and looking distraught. "Ah, here you are, Flora." The woman looked relieved to see her. "Something dreadful has happened. It's the master and Miss Constance. They've been involved in a terrible accident." Flora's heart began to thump with panic, and she suddenly felt sick. "Are they all right?" she asked in a wobbly voice. The woman shook her head. "I'm afraid not. It seems the master's silver ghost skidded and left the road before crashing into a wall. Miss Constance is in the hospital, and the master is—" She gulped deep in her throat before forcing herself to go on. "And the master is dead. God rest his soul." Chapter 1. Connie was discharged from the hospital 2 days after the tragic accident. Miraculously, she had escaped with cuts and bruises and a broken arm, which was now encased in a heavy plaster, much to her disgust. Her father's solicitor, Mr. Wainthorpe, who had also been a close family friend, collected Connie and drove her home with promises that he would return the next day to read her father's will to her. Flora, who was waiting at the door for her when she returned home, saw at a glance that her young mistress's eyes were swollen from crying. But then she supposed that this was to be expected. Connie's father had been the only close living relative that the girl had, so far as Flora knew, apart from an aunt, who she had not seen for many years, who lived in New York. "Come on, miss," she said kindly. "There's a nice hot pot of coffee being made for you. Shall I tell Gertie to bring it in to you in the day room?" "No, thank you, Flora, but I'm feeling rather tired. I think I'll have it in my room." "Of course. I'll just let Gertie know, then I'll help you up the stairs," Flora offered. Connie almost bit her head off when she snapped, "It's my arm that's broken, not my legs, in case you hadn't noticed." Then, instantly repentant, she muttered, "Sorry, Flora, I just seem—" "It's all right." Flora soothed like a mother to a child. "You're just tired and upset, but hopefully you'll feel a little better when you've had a decent nap. I know you can't sleep properly in hospital. I went in when I was about 10 to have my tonsils out, and the moans and groans from the other beds kept me awake all night." Connie nodded wearily as Flora gently steered her towards the staircase. On the way, they passed the coat stand, and at the sight of her father's Sunday best coat hanging there, Connie began to sob loudly. "It's so unfair. My father was such a kind man. Why did this have to happen?" "I don't know, miss," Flora answered gravely, as tears pricked at the back of her own eyes. Connie was quite wobbly on her feet, no doubt because of the shock and her numerous cuts and bruises, and Flora walked steadily behind her in case she fell. Once in Connie's room, Flora carefully helped her off with her gown. It was dotted with blood, and the nurses at the hospital had been forced to cut the sleeve off it to get it over her plaster cast. But from now on, that would be the least of the girl's worries. She had wardrobes full of gowns, and this one could easily be replaced. But sadly, she could never replace her father, and Flora could only imagine how she must be feeling. Flora had just slipped a nightgown over her head and helped her into bed when Gertie appeared with the coffee tray and some freshly baked shortbread still warm from the oven. Knowing how much she liked it, the kindly cook had made it especially for her, but today Connie merely shook her head and pushed the plate away. "I'm not really hungry," she said listlessly. I'll perhaps just have a little coffee. Gertie scurried away as Flora poured it, but by the time she had added milk and sugar and carried it to the bed, Connie, who was clearly exhausted, was already fast asleep. Flora hastily threw some more coal onto the fire and closed the curtains to shut out the dismal day before creeping downstairs to the kitchen. "Ah, well, happen sleep is the best cure for her in a case like this," the cook commented, as she needed some dough for a fresh batch of bread. "I'll make her a nice pan of fresh chicken soup for when she wakes up. Meantime, I should get rid of that if I were you." She nodded towards the ruined gown across Flora's arm. "It'll only upset her and bring everything back every time she looks at it." Flora agreed and hurried outside, shivering, to dispose of it. When she got back to the warmth of the kitchen, the housekeeper was there too, and she and the cook were discussing what might become of them all as the cook poured them all a cup of hot, sweet tea. "I can't see the young mistress being allowed to stay here on her own," the cook commented. "She ain't of age yet." "Well, Mr. Wainthorpe is returning tomorrow with the master's will. Hopefully we'll all know more then," Mrs. Merry answered glumly. "But if he has left instructions for the house to be sold, then we'll all be out of a job." At this, Gertie started to cry softly, and Flora patted her arm. "We'll be all right, you'll see," she told her with a confidence she was far from feeling. "My ma's a great one for saying everything happens for a reason." For now, all they could do was sit back and wait to see what fate had in store for them. On the dot of 2:00 the next afternoon, Mr. Wainthorpe arrived, and Gertie showed him into the drawing-room, where Connie was waiting for him. Flora was with her, and she instantly rose to leave, intending to give her mistress some privacy, but Connie caught at her arm. "No, don't go, Flora," she implored. "I want you to stay with me." Flora glanced uncomfortably at Mr. Wainthorpe, but when he gave her a kindly smile, she sat back down, lowered her eyes, and folded her hands primly in her lap, as Connie had taught her to do. "How are you feeling today, my dear?" he inquired gently, although Connie's bloodshot eyes had already given him his answer. He scratched his head, then, clearly feeling ill at ease, as he took a seat, and informed her. "I've made all the funeral arrangements as you requested. It will be conducted 3 days before Christmas Day. I'm afraid I couldn't get it any earlier. There's another flu epidemic, you see, and—" His voice trailed away. This was proving to be particularly difficult for him. Connie's father had been a close friend for much of his adult life, added to which he'd had a soft spot for Connie right from the day her parents had adopted her. Even so, there were legal things to be addressed, so putting aside his feelings as best he could, he withdrew a legal-looking document from a leather case and cleared his throat. "This is your father's last will and testament," he began, in a voice little above a whisper. "He updated it every year at my office, in the presence of a witness. Normally, it wouldn't be read until after the funeral, but because of the circumstances, I thought you would like to know what it contains. Shall I proceed?" Connie nodded, as tears burned at the back of her eyes. And so he began. Most of what he was saying went in one ear and out of the other, until something suddenly made her glance up with a startled look on her face. "What did you just say?" she demanded. Surely she had misheard him. "I told you that your father's wish, should anything happen to him before you reached your majority, was that you should go and reside with your Aunt Alexandra Ward in New York." "But I don't even know her," Connie yelped. "And New York? But what about the house?"
Now your father suggested that you might like to close it up with just one person staying here to maintain it until you come of age. Alternatively, if you'd prefer, it could be sold. The choice is entirely yours. As for your aunt, I have sent her a telegram telling her of what has happened, but I haven't yet received a reply, although I'm sure I will," he added hastily. Then, after studying the papers in front of him for some minutes, he went on. "It appears that your aunt was your late mother's younger sister." "I already know that," Connie said waspishly.
She has always sent birthday cards, Christmas cards and presents for as long as I can remember. But I don't actually know her, do I? What if we don't like each other? How could Father do this to me? She was clearly very upset, and Victor Wainthropp almost felt as if it was all his fault. "I'm sure she will love you," he muttered ineffectually. Connie thought on his words for a moment before saying, "And what if she doesn't even want me there?"
"Oh, apparently she and your father have had this arrangement ever since your mother passed away."
"I see." Connie chewed on her lip. "And is there an uncle there?" Mr. Wainthropp hastily turned his attention back to the paperwork balanced on his knee, and after a moment he nodded.
"Yes, it appears so."
Then, in a softer voice, he told her,
"This agreement only stands until you are 21, Connie, and then if you are unhappy, you are free to come back and reopen the house. Meanwhile, you are now a very wealthy young woman. The house, business, and all its assets are yours. It only remains for you to decide if you wish to keep the businesses running with managers in place and me overseeing them, or if you wish them to be sold. But there's no need to make a decision right away. Let's give you a few days to get over the shock of everything that's happened, and then, when the funeral is behind us after Christmas, you can decide what you wish to do. Whatever it is, I promise that I will assist you in any way I can."
Her face softened then, and she looked at him guiltily. He and her father had always been such close friends that she was sure he must be feeling his loss too. "I know you will," she said. "And I'm sorry for being so difficult. It's just that within such a short time my whole life has turned upside down, and I just can't make myself believe that I'll never see my father again. I keep expecting him to walk through the door and—" She began to cry, and Flora hurried across and placed her arm about her shoulder. For now, she forgot that this young woman was her mistress. She was just another girl, the same age as herself, who was grieving for her parent. Mr. Wainthropp, meanwhile, was gathering his papers together, and Flora could have sworn she saw tears sparkling on his lashes too.
"Well, that's about all for now,"
he said, as he rose from his seat.
"Please don't hesitate to contact me if there's anything you need. And, should you wish to say your final goodbyes to your father, he will be lying in the chapel of rest at Ducal's undertaker's as from tomorrow morning."
He pressed a piece of paper with the address into Flora's hand, and she nodded. Then, after gently squeezing Connie's heaving shoulder, he quickly departed. After a while, Connie calmed down a little, and Flora hurried away to fetch her a tray of tea, silently scolding herself that she hadn't thought to offer Mr. Wainthropp a cup. But then it wasn't really her place to, and Connie was clearly far too distressed to think about niceties.
"So what's happening?"
the rosy-cheeked cook asked the second Flora entered the kitchen. Gertie and Mrs. Merry were also there, and they too looked at her expectantly. I don't really think it's my place to tell you," Flora muttered. The cook rolled her eyes in exasperation.
"Why ever not? If we're going to be oofed out onto the street, don't you think we have a right to know?"
"Of course you do," Flora agreed hastily. "And I'm sure Miss Connie will tell you what's happening very soon. In fact, I'll ask her to speak to you as soon as she feels up to it. But I'm in the same boat, you know? If you lose your jobs, I'll lose mine too." The thought was depressing. She'd enjoyed being Connie's maid. She'd started off doing the job that Gertie did now, until Connie had asked her father if she might become her maid and companion. Edward Ogilvy had always found it very hard to deny his daughter anything, but in actual fact he had thought it was a very good idea for his daughter to have someone her own age to spend time with, now that she was a little older and was no longer receiving schooling. And so Flora had been promoted, and her life had changed drastically for the better from that moment on. Admittedly, Connie had been spoiled, and could be quite moody at times, but, overall, they had got on well together, and Flora had never looked back. She had been fortunate enough to accompany her young mistress on shopping trips, and now she wore smart but plain dresses instead of the drab maid's outfit she had become accustomed to. Connie had helped her to improve her reading and writing skills, and had done her best to rid her of her Cockney accent too. But now it looked as if it was all about to come to an end, and Flora hated the thought of having to go back to being a general maid again. Not that she had much choice. She wasn't trained to be anything else. Clearly with her nose out of joint, the cook huffed and turned her attention back to the saucepan she was stirring, as Flora prepared a tea tray and left the room as soon as she could. Back in the drawing room, Connie was staring dully into the fireplace. Glancing up as Flora came in, she asked, "So what did you think of that, then? I'm to be carted off to live with someone I've never even met, as if I'm nothing more than a parcel." "I'm sure your father was only doing what he thought was best for you," Flora assured her as she strained tea into 2 delicate china teacups. "I suppose he just wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of, and I doubt he would ask someone who he thought you might not like to step in. Your aunt is probably a lovely person." Connie sniffed. "But I can't see why I can't just stay here." After being brought up in Whitechapel, Flora was a lot more worldly wise than her mistress, who had led a sheltered, cosseted life. "Think about it. You're only just 18, and if what Mr. Wainthropp said is right, you're a very wealthy young woman. You'll have every young blade in London after you now, and it might not be for the right reason. They could be just after your money. Not that you're not very pretty," she added hastily as Connie scowled. After a while, Connie nodded. "I can see what you mean, but I'm not a complete idiot, you know. I'm sure I would recognise the gold diggers." "Well, as Mr. Wainthropp said, you have no need to make your mind up about anything just yet. But whatever you decide to do about the house and businesses, the house is going to be shut up for a few years, so perhaps you should give the staff warning. I know they're all worrying about losing their jobs, but if you tell them what's happening, at least they'll have time to look around for other positions." Seeing the sense in what Flora said, Connie nodded glumly. "I will," she promised, "but not tonight." And then, once more, she broke into a torrent of fresh weeping as Flora looked on helplessly. Chapter 2. Over the next days, Connie had an endless stream of visitors, all wishing to pay their respects and offer their condolences. Somehow, Connie greeted each of them with dignity. The tears had dried up for now, but she seemed to be a mere shadow of her former self, barely eating and seemingly only existing on endless cups of tea. "I'm really worried about her," Flora confided to the cook one evening after she had helped Connie prepare for bed. "I think even the tears were better than seeing her as she is now. She hardly says a word but just floats about the house like a lost soul." "Oh, well, that's the thing with grief," Cook nodded, setting her chins wobbling. "There's different stages you have to go through. I was the same when I lost my husband. First there's the tears and the shock, then it turns into like a dull acceptance. And the thing is, everyone takes losing someone close to him differently. It's worse for that poor girl, 'cause her father were the only one who ever really showed her any affection. When her mother were alive, she just went through the motions to save face. But Connie and her dad adored each other, see? So she's bound to take it hard. The only thing you can do is what you're doing now. Just be there for her. She'll come out of it, hopefully, once the funeral's over. But it takes time." Flora could only bow to the woman's superior wisdom and hope that she was right. But it didn't stop her worrying all the same. And now there was the funeral to get through tomorrow, and Cook had been baking from morning till night to prepare food for any of the mourners who might wish to return to the house after the service. Briefly, she wondered whether she ought to decorate the Christmas tree that had arrived the day before. It transpired that Mr. Ogilvy had ordered it to be delivered shortly before the accident. Normally, Connie and Flora would have spent the whole afternoon giggling as they decorated it with the pretty glass baubles that were packed safely away each year. But today, it merely stood propped up against the wall in the hallway. No one had even had the heart to stand it in a bucket of earth, let alone decorate it.
We'll chuck that tree out into the yard in a while. No point leaving it standing there dropping its needles all over the place if we ain't going to dress it," said Cook.
Flora nodded absently, wondering if Cook was a mind reader and wishing with all her heart that the next day could just be over. It dawned grey and overcast. The snow had thawed, and what was left of it was slushy and slippery underfoot. The dressmaker had to rush to make Connie a black dress with a wide sleeve that would slide over the plaster on her arm, and the girl stood lifelessly as Flora helped her into it. Her bruises had faded from an angry purple to dull yellows and greys that made her look sallow and ill, but the doctor had informed her that she would need to keep the cast on for at least another 4 weeks. Connie didn't seem to care. In fact, Flora was concerned that she didn't seem to care about anything anymore. It was as if she had locked herself away in a little world of her own, where no one could reach her. But again, Cook promised her that this was normal.
"She'll come out of it eventually," she had assured her.
Now, Flora piled the girl's hair up onto the top of her head and placed a bonnet with a short black veil on her, and they were ready to go. At Connie's insistence, she too was dressed from head to toe in black, and, although the gown Connie had bought for her was the best she had ever worn, Flora felt uncomfortable in it. When they stepped outside, the first thing they saw was a glass hearse pulled by 4 magnificent coal-black stallions with plumes on their heads. Inside the hearse was Mr. Ogilvy's coffin, the finest that money could buy, lead-lined and carved from rosewood with solid brass handles. Even the sight of this didn't prompt a reaction from Connie, and she climbed silently into the carriage behind it, closely followed by Flora, who she had insisted should accompany her. A fine drizzle had begun to fall, and when they reached the church, a thick fog obscured some of the gravestones from view. Throughout the service, Flora kept a close eye on her mistress, who stood woodenly, not even attempting to join in the prayers or the singing. Finally it was over, and the pallbearers lifted the coffin and followed the solemn-faced vicar out into the graveyard. The fog gave an eerie feel to the proceedings, and Flora thought the mourners looked as if they were floating between the drunkenly leaning gravestones. By this stage, Connie was gripping her hand so tightly that it was all Flora could do to stop herself from crying out. And then, at last, the coffin was lowered into the gaping grave. The final prayers were conducted, and it was all over. Slowly, the mourners drifted away to be swallowed up by the fog, but Connie stood staring down at her father's final resting place. Flora wondered what thoughts must be going through her young mistress's head. Was she remembering happy times she had spent with him? But then Connie suddenly turned abruptly and walked away, without so much as glancing back. Flora looked back just once from the lich gate and shuddered as she saw the gravediggers shoveling dirt into the grave, blocking the light of day from the dear man who lay there for all time. When they arrived back at the house, many of the mourners were already there, wandering about with cups of tea or a glass of spirits in their hand, while Mrs. Merry and Gertie circulating amongst them with plates of sandwiches and tempting treats that the cook had baked. But the minute she and Connie entered the room, a hush fell. The next second, people were vying to offer their condolences and say what a lovely man her father had been. Connie listened, nodding her head when it was required, as she walked through them to her father's favourite wing chair by the fire. Flora hovered close by. "Shall I get you something to eat?" she asked in concern. "A sandwich, perhaps? Or I could get Gertie to make you something warm. Your hands are frozen through." "Thank you, but no. I'm not hungry at the moment." Then, seeing the concern on Flora's face, she added, "Perhaps later." Flora continued to stand close to her young mistress's side, wishing that the mourners might all disappear in a puff of smoke. But it seemed they were all keen to take advantage of the feast spread out before them, and it was almost 2 hours later when the last of them finally departed, leaving only Mr. Wainthropp behind. He smiled at Flora, then, pulling up a chair close to Connie, he asked, "How are you feeling, my dear?" The second the words had left his lips, he realised how ludicrous they must sound. The poor girl had just buried her father. How could he expect her to feel? "I'm all right, thank you." She managed to raise a weak smile, so he rushed on.
"Well, I'm sure that you must be ready for a little time to yourself now, so I shall be off too. And may I say that your father would have been very proud of the dignified way you conducted yourself today. I just wanted to let you know that I have written to your aunt in New York, and the moment I get a response I shall be round to show it to you. Meanwhile, you have no need to worry about anything. I shall continue to pay the household expenses as your father requested, and I shall ensure that you receive your allowance each month. But is there anything else I can do for you? Anything at all?"
"No, thank you, Mr. Wainthropp," she replied woodenly, and so with a nod towards the girls he rose and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. "Flora, I think I'd like to be on my own for a while now, if you don't mind," Connie said, and Flora nodded understandingly. "Of course, just ring when you need anything." Flora discreetly hurried away, and was soon in the warmth of the kitchen, where Cook was sitting with her swollen ankles on a stool by the fire, and a cup of tea perched on her ample bosom.
I'm glad that's over.
"How is the poor lass?" she asked Flora, as the girl fetched a cup and lifted the teapot. Flora shrugged as she poured the stewed tea and added sugar. "Quiet as a mouse," she answered. "I think I'd rather have had the tears, but then perhaps she's got none left."
Well, soon she needs to decide what's happening here," the cook huffed. "If she's going off to her aunt's in New York and closing the house up, we'll all be out on the street without a job."
"That isn't her fault," Flora said defensively. "She wouldn't be going by choice. It was her father's express wish that she stayed with her aunt until she comes of age, but we just have to wait and see what her aunt says now. Mr. Wainthropp has written to her and is waiting on a reply."
"I dare say you're right."
Cook looked suitably shamefaced. She'd worked for the Ogilvy family for years and just didn't want things to change. But sadly, she knew that this was inevitable now, and she wondered what the future had in store for them all. Christmas was a dismal affair, as was the New Year, with no celebrations of any kind in the Ogilvy house. The staff crept about like ghosts, so as not to disturb Connie, who seemed to have locked herself away in a world of grief. The one bright spot for Flora was when she managed to slip away for a few precious hours on Christmas Eve to see her family and spend a little time with Jamie. "I can't stay long," she apologised to him breathlessly when they met at their usual meeting place. "Not with Connie in such a state." "I understand," he answered sympathetically. "The poor girl must be distraught. But here, I have something for you." He presented her with a little box that contained a small silver locket on a delicate chain, and Flora's face lit up. "Oh, Jamie, it's beautiful," she breathed as he fastened it about her neck. "I shall treasure it forever." Jamie looked at her tenderly. "It looks beautiful on you," he said, kissing her softly on the lips. "I knew it would." Flora stroked his cheek, gazing into his beautiful blue eyes, and thanked God that she had him in her life. And then, on a cold and frosty morning early in January, Mr. Wainthropp arrived with news.
"I've heard from your aunt, my dear,"
he told Connie, who had come down to the drawing-room to speak to him. It was one of the very rare occasions she had ventured downstairs since the funeral.
"And she enclosed a letter for you."
He handed the young woman an envelope before going on.
"She is quite happy for you to stay with her, so now it will be up to you to decide whether you wish to keep this house on, or if you would like me to sell it for you."
Connie looked around at the familiar room, her eyes dull. She knew every stick of furniture, every knick-knack, every corner. "I want to keep the house on," she told him listlessly. "I know my father wanted me to go to my aunt, and I shall do as he wished because I have no choice. But as soon as I reach my majority, I shall come home." Mr. Wainthropp nodded understandingly wishing there was something he could say to ease her pain.
In that case, with your permission, I shall speak to the staff. Sadly, they won't be needed while you are gone, but I shall ask Mrs. Merry if she is prepared to stay on as a caretaker. I'm sure she'll agree to it, and then at least you can go knowing that your home is being left in safe hands."
Flora entered the room then, bearing a tray of coffee and biscuits. "I thought you might like something to warm you up, sir." She smiled politely, and after pouring out the coffee, she discreetly left the room. "So, what's going on?" Gertie asked her as she went back to the kitchen. Flora shrugged. "I have no idea, but I dare say we're about to find out." She took a seat at the kitchen table, and shortly after there was a tap at the door, and Mr. Wainthorpe entered, looking decidedly uncomfortable. Mrs. Merry sidled in behind him, and seeing that the staff were all gathered together, he coughed to clear his throat before telling them,
"I have come to inform you that Miss Ogilvy's aunt in New York has replied to my letter, and she has agreed to her going to stay with her indefinitely. Mrs. Merry, Connie has decided that she will keep this house on in case she wishes to return to it. So I was wondering if you would consider staying on to take care of it."
Mrs. Merry nodded, a look of relief on her face.
"Good."
The solicitor smiled at her before turning back to the others.
"Unfortunately, this will mean that the rest of you will no longer be needed."
He saw the looks of dismay on their faces and hurried on.
"However, it is going to take me some time to arrange a passage for the young mistress, so this should give you all ample time to find another position. A couple of months, at least, I should think, and on top of that, she has asked me to give you all an extra month's wages when you do leave."
This statement went a long way to calming them, and Gertie sighed with relief. "Well, at least we ain't going to be chucked out on us arses tomorrow," she commented dryly, which drew a disapproving frown from Cook.
"Ah, well, I think we all expected this," the older woman sighed. "But thank you, Mr. Wainthorpe. Under the circumstances, the young miss is being more than fair. After all, it ain't as if she wants to go, is it?" "Quite."
Mr. Wainthorpe shuffled from foot to foot.
"Now, if you will excuse me, I should get on, but rest assured I shall keep you all informed. Good day, ladies."
And with that he took his leave. Once the door had closed behind him, Gertie sighed, and, tears in her eyes, glanced around the kitchen. "I've loved working here, and I'll be really sorry to go," she said regretfully.
"We all will," Cook pointed out, "but there's no point in crying over spilt milk. And you've got age on your side, Gertie, and you have, Flora. I heard yesterday as they were setting on in the jam factory if you can't get another living position. They earn good money there, by all accounts."
"I might try there," Flora said, but her heart was heavy. She had loved her time working as a personal lady's maid, but then she supposed any job was better than none. Although she would miss Connie and the rest of the staff desperately.
"Right, well, at least we know where we all stand now, so chop chop, let's have you back to work,"
Cook ordered bossily. Obediently, they went about their duties, although now they were all wondering what was to become of them. In the drawing room, Connie was unfolding the letter her aunt had enclosed with Mr. Wainthorpe's, and she began to read. "My dearest girl, I cannot begin to tell you how distraught your uncle and I were to read of your father's untimely accident. He was a truly wonderful man, and will always be remembered fondly. Of course, you must come to us for as long as you need to, forever if necessary. I have instructed Mr. Wainthorpe to organise your passage here as soon as is possible, and to let us know when we might expect you, so that someone can be there to meet you off the ship. Your arrival cannot come quickly enough for me. Until then, know that I am thinking of you and very much looking forward to seeing you. With much love, Aunt Alexandra. Kiss, kiss, kiss." As soon as Flora joined her again, Connie handed her the letter and urged her to read it. "She sounds nice at any rate," Flora said miserably once she had read it and handed it back. But I wonder why my mother and she never really kept in touch, Connie said thoughtfully. From what I can remember, my mother never had a kind word to say about her. In fact, I can remember she used to get really huffy every time we heard from her. Rather strange, considering she was her younger sister, don't you think? I suppose she had her reasons, Flora said cautiously. And she certainly sounds like she's looking forward to having you there, which is the main thing, surely. I suppose so. Connie sighed, but she didn't sound at all convinced. Chapter 3. Cheer up, it ain't the end of the world, Flora's mother told her when she visited her home on the following Sunday afternoon. Something will turn up, you'll see, she told her daughter optimistically as she stirred the large pan of stew and dumplings simmering on the range. So when is Connie planning to leave? Flora shrugged, looking thoroughly miserable. She doesn't know yet. Mr. Wainthrop is making all the travelling arrangements for her. He reckons it could be March or April before she goes, but I don't want her to go. I'm going to miss her so much. Her mother's face softened and she gently squeezed her daughter's hand. She knew how close Flora and her young mistress had become. There you are then, Emily said. That gives you more than enough time to look round for another position. A clever young lass like you shouldn't have any trouble at all finding something else. Now, how about a nice dish of this stew to warm you up? She suggested, hoping to cheer her up a little. Flora shook her head as she reached for her thick shawl. It had been a present from her mother for Christmas. No, thanks, Ma. I'm meeting Jamie in half an hour. Huh! Emily tutted as she glanced through the window at the frosted cobblestones. You must be mad trailing about in this weather. It's enough to freeze you out there. Still, I dare say I'd have done the same at your age. She crossed to pull Flora's shawl over her mop of thick dark hair and followed her to the door. Now, don't you go fretting. Things'll come right, you'll see. Flora kissed her cheek, then hurried off to meet Jamie. He was standing where he always waited for her on the dock, and at the sight of his tall figure, Flora's breath caught. He was so good-looking, with his curly fair hair that seemed to have a life of its own, and twinkling blue eyes that always seemed to be smiling. Her heart speeded up at the sight of him, and the butterflies started fluttering in her stomach. Flora knew she had to accept that no matter how much she tried to deny it, she was in love with him. The thought of seeing him each week was the one thing that was keeping her going at the moment. His face lit up at the sight of her, and she smiled back. It feels like ages since I last saw you. How are you bearing up? How's Connie? He said, as he wrapped his arms around her and gave her a soft kiss. Then, hooking his arm possessively about her waist, he began to wander along as she told him about what Mr. Wainthrop had said. But it's not the end of the world, he pointed out, much as her mother had done. I know that, Flora said miserably. But I really enjoyed being a lady's maid to Connie, and we've grown close. Well, if it's money you're worried about, don't, he told her. Because I've got some I could let you have. She stared at him curiously, and it came to her then that she didn't really know all that much about his background, except that he had been orphaned as a child and then adopted by a couple in the Midlands. She knew that the stevedores and the men who worked on the docks weren't very highly paid, and yet whenever she met him on a Sunday, he was well turned out in what looked like surprisingly expensive clothes. He was well spoken too, and sounded more like a gentleman than a dock worker. She'd not thought about it properly before, and had just assumed he didn't like talking about his childhood. But now she felt able to ask him a bit more. So how come you're so flush? She asked curiously, and he grinned. Let's just say that my parents aren't short of a bob or two, he answered. Flora scowled. So why are you working here then? He shrugged. Because I want to. It's as simple as that. My parents weren't too happy with the idea, but I want to see a bit of life. So who exactly are your parents? Flora asked, more curious than ever now. Jamie scratched his chin. Well, as I told you, They're my adoptive parents. I can't really remember much about my natural parents, except I can remember being always cold and hungry. But I was lucky because Sunday and Tom Branning took me to live with them then. From then on, I had a wonderful life. They run a children's home called Treetops in a village called Hartshill near Nuneaton, and from that moment on, my life changed for the better. It's a great rambling house surrounded by woods. It used to belong to Sunday's mother, who was once married to a lord, and they treated all of the children who lived there like their own. They never had children of their own, you see. So we all had the best of everything, the best clothes, the best food, the best educations. But most of all, they loved us and made us feel we were wanted. But as I got older, I started to feel that I wanted to spread my wings a bit, try different jobs, and see a bit more of the country. So here I am. To be honest, though, I don't think I would have stayed as long as I have if I hadn't met a certain young lady. Flora blushed prettily as he squeezed her arm. When and if I decide to settle down, I shall probably head back there. Nuneaton is a market town, and the pace of life is so much gentler there than it is in the city. I suppose I'd want my children to be brought up somewhere where there's woods and countryside around them, but we'll have to wait and see what happens, won't we? Flora nodded as she glanced up at him, and her heart did a little cartwheel again. Jamie was truly handsome, but it was more than just his looks that made her heart beat faster. And now that he had opened up a little more about his past, she was beginning to understand what made him stand out to her. He was so different to the people hereabouts. He'd had a very privileged upbringing and all the advantages he could have wished for, and yet he had an independent spirit as well. Otherwise, why else would he have set out on his own to experience what life had to offer? She hugged his arm closer, and for the next hour they strolled about, talking about their hopes and dreams, and barely noticing how cold it was. When the light began to fade, Jamie reluctantly walked her back to the house. "Don't get worrying about your future," he said softly, then gently kissed her lips. "See you next Sunday." He walked away whistling merrily, and she stood for a moment watching him, her mind all of a whirl. She had promised herself that she would focus on a career before settling down, but Jamie had just wriggled his way into her life, and the thought of him moving back to his hometown without her made her heart sink. Shivering suddenly, she hurried inside, out of the cold. It was early in February when Mr. Wainthorpe called again. The two girls were in the morning room, altering a dress that Connie had given to Flora, and Connie eyed him nervously when he appeared. "I think I might have quite an exciting idea to put to you," he told Connie, while Flora hurried away to fetch a tray of coffee and biscuits. "I've been making inquiries about a ship that might take you to New York, and I spotted this article in the paper about a brand new liner that's to be launched for her maiden voyage in April. She's called the Titanic and is said to be unsinkable. She's also supposed to be the most luxurious ship that ever sailed the seas. A veritable floating hotel, in fact. It has everything you could wish for. Tennis courts, swimming pools, restaurant, squash court, Turkish baths, and even shops aboard. It is quite expensive to travel on her, of course, but they say that the elite of society are booking their passages already. I thought it might be nice for you to travel in style. Now, it is a bit expensive, £870 for a first-class suite of rooms, but luckily you can afford it, and I think you deserve a little treat. What do you think?" "I suppose it does sound lovely, but that's an awful lot of money," Connie pointed out doubtfully. He chuckled. "My dear, that's a drop in the ocean, excuse the pun, to you. At least give it some thought. I shall be calling back in a few days, so let me know then. Meanwhile, I'll leave you this newspaper so that you can read all about it. It looks set to be the trip of a lifetime, just what you need to lift your spirits after... Well, anyway, let me know what you think." He rose to leave, and remembering her manners, Connie asked, "Won't you stay for coffee? Flora should be back with it any moment now." "I won't, if you don't mind," he demurred. "I have to be in court with a client this afternoon, so I should get on. Good day, my dear." He rammed his hat onto his unruly thatch of grey hair and retreated hurriedly, leaving Connie to read about the Titanic. "Oh, has Mr. Wainthorpe left already?" Flora asked when she appeared with a loaded tray minutes later. Connie nodded absently. Yes, he has to be in court soon, but he called in to ask if I'd like to make a trip to my aunt's on this ship. Look at the picture of her. She looks absolutely enormous. Blimey. Flora stared at the picture of the ship in awe, as side by side they began to read about her. It says that she's over 800 feet long. Flora whistled through her teeth, which brought a scowl from Connie, but she ignored it. So how can anything so huge and obviously heavy even float? She asked, bewildered. It's the design, I suppose. Connie chewed on her nail, a habit she had adopted since her father's death. Look, it says the ship contains 15 watertight bulkheads running across the hull, whatever those are. That's what makes it unsinkable, apparently. And she could travel at 24 to 25 knots. I suppose that must be fast if they've written about it here, which means we could get to New York really quickly. Connie read on. She has a sister ship called the Olympic, and it says here that the Titanic is only slightly larger. So you see, a ship that size can float. I have to say, it sounds wonderful. It will be quite an adventure for you, Flora said with a touch of envy in her voice. But even so, she was pleased to see Connie taking an interest in something again. She had been gravely worried about her. Connie eyed her thoughtfully as something occurred to her. So why don't you come with me then? She suggested. Me? On the Titanic? Going to New York? Flora bleated, dumbstruck. Why not? Connie shrugged. I would feel better if I had someone I knew accompanying me. And it's not as if it's forever. I fully intend to come back when I'm 21. Think about it. This could be an adventure for you too. Flora stared back at her open-mouthed. The idea was preposterous. And yet, as Connie had said, it wouldn't be forever, and it would be an opportunity that may never come her way again. I'd have to see what my ma and dad thought of the idea, she said. And Jamie, of course. Mother and father, Connie corrected her. And yes, of course you'd need to speak to them, but do please give it some serious thought. I'm dreading going to live with strangers, but if I had you there to support me... I will, Flora promised, her mind reeling at the prospect. New York. Suddenly, she had an awful lot of thinking to do. When she told her mother of Connie's offer on her next afternoon off, Emily stared at her open-mouthed. All that way on a big ship? She croaked fearfully. Oh, but it's quite safe. Unsinkable, apparently, Flora assured her. And it would only be for less than 3 years till Connie comes of age. Oh, I know it's a long time, Ma, but it's not as if I'm planning on going forever, is it? I suppose not, Emily admitted reluctantly. But what about young Jamie? He's clearly very sweet on you. Will he be willing to wait all that while for you? 3 years is still an awful long time, even at your age. I know. The thought of leaving Jamie had been preying heavily on Flora's mind too. What was she to do? Was their relationship worth giving up the chance of a lifetime for? She loved him, but she still wasn't sure she was ready to settle down yet. But if she did go, would he wait for her? She couldn't bear the idea that he wouldn't. But the pull of adventure was strong. She'd never even been out of London before, and after what he'd told her about his background and why he'd left home, she was sure he'd understand. Flora chewed her lip nervously, feeling sick at the thought of losing him. But surely, she reasoned to herself, if he really loved her, he would be prepared to wait. Well, she'd find out soon enough. After leaving her mother's, Flora walked to their usual meeting place with butterflies in her stomach, and there was Jamie waiting for her with a broad smile on his face. Is everything all right? He queried, noting the preoccupied look on her face as he tucked her hand into his arm and began to stroll along. Flora licked her lips, which were suddenly dry. It all depends what you mean by all right, she said, then hurried on to tell him what Connie had suggested. So, the long and short of it is, Connie wants me to go to New York with her. she finished breathlessly. New York? Jamie was clearly shocked. But what about Oz? It would only be for 3 years or so, she told him timidly, wondering why she felt so guilty. And just think what an opportunity it would be for me to see a bit of the world before I settle down. I could show you as much of the world as you want to see, he answered grumpily. I've told you I'm not short of a bob or two, and, well, to be honest, I was hoping to speak to your father soon, you know, about making our relationship official. Oh, Jamie. Flora's eyes welled with tears as she drew him to a halt and looked up into his handsome face. I think the world of you, you know I do, but I don't think I'm ready to get married just yet. We'll both be so much older and wiser when I come back if I go with Connie, and perhaps then, if we still feel the same way about each other. What you're saying is you expect me to sit about here waiting for you to come home in the hope that you'll have made your mind up on whether you want me or not in 3 years' time. That's what you're saying, isn't it? His eyes were flashing fire now, and Flora felt devastated. No, I didn't mean that. She yanked her hand out of his arm and glared back at him, feeling as if she was being pulled in 2 directions. On the one hand, how could she abandon her dear friend just when she needed her so badly? Connie was all alone in the world, and when Flora thought about it, she realised that she was Connie's only true friend. But then again, looking into Jamie's furious eyes, she could also see his hurt, and that made her feel terrible. Whichever way she turned, she'd hurt someone she loved. Surely, if you love me as you claim to, you'd be happy to wait. Suddenly, the thought of leaving him for all that time was painful, but Connie needed her too. His head wagged from side to side as he took a step back. 3 years is a long time. I don't think you understand. I love you, Flora. I want to marry you. And if you're happy to leave the minute someone suggests, it seems you don't feel the same. Happen you've got a lot of thinking to do and some difficult decisions to make, he rasped. Should you decide we do have a future together, I'll be here at the same time next Sunday, and if you're not, then I'll know what my answer is. And with that, he turned abruptly and marched away, without giving her so much as another glance. Flora watched him leave, tears pouring down her cheeks. More than ever now, she realised how empty her life would be without him. But how would Connie cope going all that way alone? As Jamie had pointed out, 3 years was a very long time, a lifetime in fact, and she realised it was too much to expect from him. As she turned to set off back to the house, her heart broke, because, much as she loved him, Connie had been so good to her, and she loved her too. And then there was a part of her that she hadn't even been aware existed until now, a reckless side that longed for adventure, no matter what the cost.
End of CD 1. CD 2.
Chapter 4. Mrs. Merry was the first person Flora set eyes on when she entered the house, and the kindly housekeeper saw at a glance that something was wrong. "Come along to my room, dear," she said, taking Flora's elbow. "I'll make you a nice hot cup of tea, and you can tell me what's bothering you." Flora went without argument, and sat in Mrs. Merry's comfy fireside chair, as the woman bustled about preparing the teacups and warming the teapot. "So, were your parents not keen on the idea of you travelling so far?" she asked eventually, when they both sat with steaming cups of tea in front of them. "It wasn't so much my parents as Jamie." Flora looked thoroughly miserable. "Is that your young man?" Mrs. Merry asked gently. Flora nodded, her eyes still bright with unshed tears. "Yes, we have been walking out together for some time, but I never dreamed he'd take the idea so badly." You're in a bit of a dilemma then." Mrs. Merry sipped at her tea delicately. "All I can advise is you must do what you want to do, not what someone else wants you to do. I must admit I would be far happier if I knew that you were accompanying Miss Constance. It's a very long way for her to travel alone, but as I said, it's up to you." Flora nodded in agreement, and after draining her cup and thanking Mrs. Merry, she made her way up to her room. Even though it was still her afternoon off, and her time was hers to do with as she pleased, she decided that she needed to speak to Connie. So, after taking off her bonnet and her coat, she made her way to her young mistress's room and tapped on the door. She found Connie sitting on the window seat reading a short book of Shakespeare's sonnets. "I thought you would still be at your parents' or walking with Jamie," she remarked, looking mildly surprised to see her. "Has something happened? Have your parents refused to give their permission for you to come with me?" "Oh no, they haven't," Flora assured her hastily. "I don't think they're thrilled with the idea, but they won't stop me. It's Jamie that's the problem. He took it quite badly when I told him that I had the chance to go." "I see." Connie looked crestfallen. "So have you reached a decision?" Flora shook her head. "Not yet," she admitted. "I feel as if I'm being pulled in two different directions. I want to come with you, of course I do. But then, as you know, I'm also very fond of Jamie, and he's made it more than obvious that he's not prepared to wait for me." Throwing her book aside, Connie hurried across to Flora in a swirl of silken skirts. "But Flora, I need you to come with me," she said, her lip trembling. "I'm closer to you than anyone else on earth now that Daddy is gone. You know everything about me, and leaving here won't be half so bad if I know that you are coming too. Oh, please think about it, Flora. Surely if Jamie truly loved you, he would be prepared to wait. 3 years isn't such an awful long time after all, is it?" "I suppose not," Flora said uncertainly. She was so confused. She didn't know if she was coming or going at that moment. She loved Connie and Jamie in different ways, and whatever she decided, one of them was going to be hurt. "I think I ought to sleep on it, so if there's nothing you need, I think I'll go to my room and get some rest." "Yes, why don't you do that?" Connie said quickly. She would have done anything to get her way. She usually did, as her father had spoiled her shamelessly, even more so after the death of her mother. And so Flora trudged heavy-hearted back to her room, where she lay on her bed as the afternoon shadows lengthened, trying to decide which direction she should take. It was funny. She thought she'd known she was falling in love with Jamie before. But now there was a chance she might lose him. She realized how strong that love actually was. Could she really risk giving that up? Downstairs, Mrs. Merry was restlessly pacing up and down her sitting room like a caged animal. She had been like a surrogate mother to Constance, since long before her adoptive mother had died. For Alicia Ogilvy had never had much time for the child, and had been only too happy to leave the little girl in the care of a nanny and the housekeeper. Now the kindly woman looked upon the young girl as her own child, for she had never been blessed with children. Mr. Ogilvy's death had come as a great shock to her, but that was nothing compared to the shock she had felt when she'd learned that Constance was to be sent away to live with her aunt. Her only consolation was that Constance had assured her she would return as soon as she possibly could, which would hopefully be in a little under 3 years. Thankfully, she was being allowed to stay in the house to wait for her return, but now how could she ensure that Flora went with her? Constance had led a very sheltered life, and Mrs. Merry feared what might happen to her if she had to travel alone. The answer to all her concerns presented itself to her the very next morning, when a tap came at the door. The young maid was busily cleaning, so it was Mrs. Merry who answered it to find a very respectable-looking young man standing on the doorstep. He hastily swept his hat off, as he said politely, "I'm so sorry to trouble you. I know that Flora will be working, but would it be possible to speak to her, just for a moment? I won't keep her, I assure you." "May I ask who is calling?" "Of course, I'm James Branning, a friend of Flora's." So this is Jamie, she thought, as she stared steadily back at him. She could see now why the decision Flora was being forced to make was so difficult. Even so, Constance was still her main priority, so she answered, "I'm afraid Flora and her mistress have gone out for a short walk. Flora thought the fresh air might do her mistress good." She felt sick with guilt, but she didn't know what else to do. "Oh, I see." His shoulders visibly sagged with disappointment. Softening slightly, she asked, "Could I perhaps take a message for her?" "Yes." He looked a little uncomfortable and shuffled from foot to foot before saying, "Could you tell her that I've received word that my father has suffered a slight stroke, and I have to return home to Nuneaton for a time? I shall write and let her know what's going on, but yesterday we parted on bad terms, and I wanted to tell her that I was sorry, and that I didn't mean what I said." His cheeks were flaming with colour now. "I shall tell her," Mrs. Merry answered as she began to close the door on him. "And I do hope that your father makes a full recovery." The door clicked shut just as Flora appeared from the drawing room to ask, "Who is that, Mrs. Merry?" "Oh, just some peddler trying to sell rubbish," the older woman answered. Then, turning about, she headed for the kitchen, feeling sick to her stomach. Flora swallowed her disappointment as she glanced at the door. She had secretly hoped that it might be Jamie calling to tell her that he would wait for her. But then, she consoled herself, there was still time, and if he didn't come, she would tell him on Sunday just how much he meant to her. Feeling slightly heartened at the thought, she went back to join Connie in the drawing room. The following Sunday, when Flora set off for her mother's, she was in high spirits. She had reached her decision, but before she told Constance, she decided she would tell her parents and Jamie first. "So you're not going, then? Well, I can't say as I'm sorry," her mother told her as she placed a freshly baked scone on the table in front of her. "I was worried sick about you going all that way, but what changed your mind? I had a feeling you were intending to go last week." "I was," Flora admitted. "But then I got to thinking, and I realised how much I'd miss you all, and Jamie." "Ah, I see," Emily chuckled. "Got under your skin, has he? Then I reckon it's time you brought him home to meet the family. I'll lay a nice little tea on for you next week. But now get that drink down you and go and put the poor lad out of his misery." Minutes later, Flora set off for the docks with her face glowing. She could hardly wait to see Jamie's face when she told him the news. But as she approached the spot where they normally met, she was surprised to see that he wasn't there. She began to walk up and down in an effort to keep warm as she waited for him. Once or twice, she saw men approaching, and her heart leapt as she started to rush towards them, a broad smile on her face as she tried to imagine how happy he would be when she told him of her decision and how much she loved him. But as they drew closer, she saw that it wasn't him, and she quickly turned away. Feeling foolish and hoping they hadn't noticed her smiling at them. Slowly, the minutes ticked away, and after what felt like a very long time, it dawned on her that he wasn't coming, and anger began to build inside her. "He can damn well please himself if he wants to be so petty," she fumed to herself as she turned and headed for her employer's home. "He couldn't have thought much of me if he couldn't even wait to hear whether I intended to go away or not." She rubbed at her cold face and realised that it was wet with tears. She dashed them away angrily. She refused to allow him to hurt her, not after he'd left her waiting for him. Well, that was the last time she'd trust a man who claimed to love her. She sniffed and tried not to think of the future she had imagined for the two of them and how it had disappeared like morning mist. Once back at the house, she barged into Connie's room without knocking, and before she could change her mind, she told her young mistress, "I've made my decision, miss. I'm coming with you. So could you ask Mr. Wainthorpe to arrange a passage on the Titanic for me too, please?" Delighted, Connie threw her arms about her. "Oh, that's wonderful news," she exclaimed. "It won't be half so bad if I have you to keep me company. I'll send word to Mr. Wainthorpe first thing in the morning." And so it was decided, and Flora wondered why she didn't feel excited at the prospect anymore. Mrs. Merry, on the other hand, was elated when Flora told her of her decision to go, although she also felt incredibly guilty. She'd noticed Flora wasn't looking her normal cheery self, and she knew that this was her fault. Had she informed her of Jamie's visit, she had no doubt the girl's decision might have been very different. But it was too late to do anything about it. Now all she had to do was worry about them going all that way on such a big ship. "It's all right, Mary," Connie told her. "We shall be quite safe." Mrs. Merry huffed. "I shan't rest until I know you've arrived safely at your aunt's. It feels like you're going to the other side of the world." Connie and Flora exchanged an amused glance, then went to the loft to start bringing down the luggage they would need for their trip. 5 days later, when Mrs. Merry collected the mail from the doormat one morning, she saw a letter with an uneaten postmark addressed to Flora, and she hastily thrust it into her pocket. She hated being so deceitful, but then, she reasoned, it was in Connie's best interests for Flora to go with her to New York, and that's what mattered most. When she finally got an opportunity to be on her own, she opened the letter, and as she read Jamie's words, her eyes filled with tears. My dearest, I'm so sorry I missed you when I popped round to Connie's house to see you, and I'm also sorry that we parted on bad terms. Although I hate the idea of us being apart for 3 long years, I shouldn't have said what I said, and I sincerely hope that you will forgive me, for the thought of a life without you is unbearable. Of course you must go to New York if you feel that Connie needs you, safe in the knowledge that I will still be here waiting for you when you get back, no matter how long you are gone. My father remains quite poorly, so it will be some time before I'm able to be back in London, although, thankfully, the doctor hopes that he will eventually make a full recovery. Please write back to me, my love, and tell me that I am forgiven. Until then, all my love, Jamie. Kiss, 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 kiss. Mrs. Merry gulped as she jammed the letter back into the envelope and pushed it deep into the pocket of her pinny. The deceit was proving hard to live with, but surely she was right to think of Connie above all others, fond as she was of Flora. All she had to do now was pray that Jamie didn't return before the girls set off on their journey. Over the next few weeks, Connie and Flora carefully packed whatever clothes they thought they might need in New York, and set about packing a separate trunk of clothes they would need for the journey. Connie was still dressed in dark clothes, black, lilac and purple, as a sign of respect for her father, but she did give Flora a number of things that she no longer wore, and Flora was thrilled with them. You look quite the young lady, Flora's mother commented when she visited wearing one of Connie's discarded gowns late in February. Though I can't think of what made you change your mind about going. You was quite adamant that you wouldn't not so long ago. Flora flushed. She was too proud to tell her mother that it was because Jamie had dumped her, and merely shrugged. A girl can change her mind, can't she? She quipped, and got on with slicing the cheese they were having for tea. Disgruntled, Emily didn't make any more comments. She knew her daughter inside out. Flora could be as stubborn as an old mule when she had a mind to be, and she also knew her well enough to know that she wouldn't let her young mistress down now that all the travel arrangements had been made. She just wished that she wasn't going, because she knew that she would miss her terribly, and 3 years was an awfully long time. Chapter 5. The next night, Elizabeth Merry tossed and turned restlessly in her bed. Constance had received another letter from her aunt, and had questioned her about what she was like. Does she look anything like my mother? Is she nice? Constance had asked curiously. I suppose there was a similarity in their looks, Mrs. Merry had answered. But she decided that this was as much as she would divulge. In truth, she had never really liked her mistress. Alicia Ogilvy had been beautiful to look at, admittedly, but her heart had been made of stone, and she had often wondered why the master put up with her. Alicia had never been content, and had been even less so after they had adopted Constance, whereas she herself had fallen in love with the baby at first sight, and had loved her ever since. It was she who Connie would run to as a child if she fell and grazed her knee. She was too afraid to go to her mother for fear of getting blood on one of her fine gowns. It was Mrs. Merry who would read the child a story each night and tuck her into bed. Alicia had usually been too busy gadding here or there or resting in her room. On the other hand, her sister, Alexandra, had been a gentle, caring soul from what Mrs. Merry could remember of her from the few times she had visited them. She had married a titled gentleman who was many years older than herself when she was still very young, and gone to live with him in New York. And from what she had heard the late mistress say, it had been the biggest mistake of her life. Alexandra's husband had made a virtual prisoner of her, and, like Alicia had been, he was just as cold and uncaring as a dead fish, as well as being insanely jealous. And now Mrs. Merry worried about how he would treat Constance. Would he welcome her into his home, or would the next 3 years be unbearable for the girl? Whatever the outcome, she was uncomfortably aware that there was nothing she could do about it apart from pray that the time would pass quickly until Constance could come home to her again. The next morning, Mr. Wainthorpe arrived bright and early, as did yet another letter with the Nuneaton postmark, which Mrs. Merry hurriedly hid in her skirt pocket before scuttling away to read it in private. It was from Jamie, as she had guessed, and was just as heartbreaking as the last letter he had written. My dearest girl, I am so disappointed that I have not as yet received a reply to my letter. Is it because you have been too busy to write? Or is it because you have not forgiven me? I cannot bear this bad feeling between us, Flora. Please write soon and put me out of my misery. I miss you every single day. I have now given notice on the room I was renting in London, but will soon find another when I return. On a happier note, I am pleased to be able to tell you that my father is making a good recovery, and I pray that very soon now I might be able to return to put things right between us. Please, please write to me, my darling. All my love always, Jamie. Kiss, 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 kiss. Tears flowed freely down Mrs. Merry's cheeks as she slowly made her way to her room, and she wavered as the enormity of what she was doing by withholding the letters from Flora came home to her. But then her loyalty and love for Connie made her harden her heart, and opening her drawer, she added Jamie's letter to the first.
I have all your tickets here,
Mr. Wainthorpe told the girls in the drawing-room, as he placed an envelope on the table.
I have booked you the finest first-class suite of rooms, and adjoining it is a room for you, Flora. I'm sure you will be quite comfortable.
I'm sure we shall, Mr. Wainthorpe, Constance said politely, but her voice was dull, as were her eyes. Since losing her father, she seemed to have lost all her sparkle, and even the excitement of preparing for their adventure hadn't brought it back.
I have also taken the liberty of booking you into a hotel in Southampton, quite close to where you will sail from for the evening before your departure,
he informed her.
The first part of the journey to Southampton will be by train the day before you set sail, and again the tickets are all there.
You have been most helpful. He stared at her for a moment, wishing that there was something he could say that would ease her pain, but of course he knew there wasn't. Grief was a funny thing. Different people grieved in different ways, and there was a process to go through before the healing could begin. He knew that better than most after losing his beloved wife some years before. Now he just hoped that a trip on what was being claimed to be the most luxurious ship in the world might help take her mind off things a little. Could he have known it, Flora was also looking forward to their journey with very mixed feelings. Part of her was excited at the thought of the adventure that lay ahead, but the other part was sad at Jamie's abrupt exit from her life. It was only now that he was gone that she realized just how unfair she had been to him. He had often told her how much he cared for her, but she had never committed to him, so she supposed the way he had reacted to the thought of her leaving served her right. Days before, she had swallowed her pride and visited the lodging-house he had been staying in, only to be told by his landlady that he had vacated his room some time ago. She supposed that she could have travelled to his hometown to try to find him, but how did she know if he was even there? He could have gone anywhere. Anyway, now she knew that he had gone, pride forbade her from doing that. What would be the point? He clearly hadn't thought as much of her as she had thought he did. So she had tried to put him from her mind now and focus on the adventure ahead.
I shall be bringing you a sum of money to travel with a little nearer to the time, Mr. Wainthorpe went on. And of course I shall have some transferred into a bank account in New York that you will be able to draw on whenever you wish. But now I really should get on. Good day, ladies.
He gave a little bow, and Mrs. Merry showed him out as Flora gathered the documents together. I'll go and put these with our luggage, shall I? Constance nodded, so she left the girl alone and hurried away upstairs. Mrs. Merry joined her moments later to show her a little bag she had fashioned. I've made this for you to carry Constance's jewels in, she told Flora solemnly. "You know how careless she can be about leaving them lying about. It fits about your waist on the belt beneath your skirt or dress. Look." She hurriedly attached it around Flora's waist, and the girl thought how ingenious it was. It was made of a very thick twill material that Mrs. Merry had added many coats of varnish to make it as waterproof as it could possibly be. "You can keep her aunt's address in there as well, in case you forget it, and any other important papers," the kindly woman told her. "And I'm making one for Constance to wear." Flora stifled the urge to laugh. She felt there was very little likelihood of them needing waterproof belts. Already she knew the address they were going to by heart, and even if she didn't, they were being met off the ship. But not wishing to offend the kind soul, she gave her a grateful smile. "That's ingenious, Mrs. Merry, and have no fear. I shall make sure we both wear them at all times." Mrs. Merry looked pleased, and once she had left the room, Flora wandered to the window and peered out into the garden. Winter was melting away, and spring was in the air. It couldn't come quickly enough as far as she was concerned. The last couple of months had been full of doom and gloom, but surely, when the trees began to come to life again, and the flowers began to peep through the hedgerows, they would all feel better. Then, with a sigh, she went about her duties. On Sunday afternoon, just as she had every Sunday since they had parted, Flora made her way to her and Jamie's meeting place on the off chance that he might be there. Her eyes moved up and down the road, looking for a glimpse of him as the minutes ticked away, but once again she was disappointed, and eventually, with a heavy heart, she turned in the direction of her mother's. Soon it would be too late to tell him that she did genuinely care for him. She and Connie would be gone. But what could she do about it? "What's that with you, then?" Her mother greeted her when she stepped through the door. "You've got a face on you like a wet weekend." Flora shrugged as Timmy pottered over to her and wrapped his arms about her waist. "Oh, nothing, Millie. I suppose I'm just getting a bit nervous about going so far away from home, now that the time to leave is drawing closer," she murmured. She would miss seeing them all every week. But then, trying to be a little more cheerful, she told her mother, "Gertie has got herself a new job. She's quite excited about it, as it happens, though goodness knows how she'll go on. She's going to work in a cafe, but she's a terrible butterfingers. Mrs. Merry is always telling her off about dropping things." "I dare say she'll cope," her mother said stoically, as she expertly sawed a freshly baked loaf into thick slices. There were hard-boiled eggs to go with it this week, courtesy of the neighbour whose sister had visited, bringing along a basketful from her hens on her small farm on the outskirts of the city. Emily cut the bread slices in half, and when 15-year-old Eunice daringly pinched one from the bowl, she slapped her hand with the back of the carving knife. Eunice merely giggled and skipped away as Flora stared round at the familiar room. Her father was sitting in his chair at the side of the fire, snoozing with the newspaper open on his lap. Only Ben and Katie were missing, and when Flora commented on it, her mother chuckled. "Well, they're both at the age when they're just discovering the attraction of the opposite sex," Emily said with a sigh. "Our Katie is smitten with a young chap who works at the match factory with her, and Ben has his eye on one of his mate's sisters. At this rate, you'll all be flown the nest before I know it." "Now, Ma, you know that's not true," Flora scolded. "I shan't be gone forever for a start off. I shall be back before you know it." "You might think that now, but 3 years is a long while. A lot can happen in that time. You might meet a handsome young American who sweeps you off your feet and decide to stay there." "I think that's rather unlikely." After the way Jamie had disappeared out of her life so abruptly, Flora secretly thought it would be some long time before she trusted a fellow again. And anyway, she knew that there would never be anyone but Jamie for her. She stayed a little longer than usual that day, firstly, because she no longer had to rush away to meet Jamie, and secondly, because she was suddenly realizing how much she was going to miss them all when she was gone. One day in March, when Connie was sitting reading the newspaper, she asked Flora, "Have you read this, about the suffragettes going on the rampage in West London? Over 120 of them have been arrested, including Mrs. Pankhurst. They attacked the shops, causing thousands of pounds worth of damage, and threw stones at number 10 Downing Street. They're awfully brave, aren't they?
Stupid, more like. Cook sniffed.
She didn't believe in women fighting for their rights at all. As far as she was concerned, girls were bred to be wives and mothers. It was perhaps as well that Miss Connie was going to New York after all. She'd always had a mind of her own, and had she been staying, she wouldn't have been at all surprised to find her getting involved with the movement. I'm not sure they're brave, Flora answered. I mean, I do believe that women should have equal rights to men, but surely they could go about getting them in a more peaceful manner.
Well said,
Cook agreed, and dropping the tray of tea she had brought them onto the table, she sniffed disapprovingly and shuffled away.
But at least she's starting to take an interest in things again, she thought,
and took it as a good sign. Before they knew it, April had arrived, and suddenly it was the week before the girls were due to leave. There was a flurry of last-minute packing and making sure they had everything they needed before their trunks were collected to go ahead of them onto the ship. As Flora made her way home after saying goodbye to her siblings on her last Sunday afternoon before their departure, her eyes were full of tears and her mind full of doubts as to whether she was doing the right thing. But it was too late to do anything about it now. Connie was a bundle of nerves, and Mrs. Merry wasn't much better, so by Monday morning they were all slightly irritable. I shall be glad when it's time to catch the train tomorrow morning and just get underway now, Flora commented to Mrs. Merry as she helped her prepare the evening meal.
Yes, I suppose it will be for the best,
the woman answered, and lowering her head to hide the guilty stain that rose in her cheeks as she thought of the letters hidden in her drawer, she sliced the cold beef that was left over from dinner time. She was going to make sandwiches with it, as none of them seemed to have much appetite today. Gertie had left to take up her new post at the cafe the week before, and she was already missing her, so she dreaded to think how she was going to feel when Connie and Flora were gone too. It was an awfully large house to rattle round in on her own, but then she was grateful that she still had a home at least. Connie had gone to her room to have a rest some time ago, so when the tray was prepared, Flora nipped upstairs to fetch her, while Mrs. Merry carried their meal through to the dining room. She had just placed the tray on the table when someone rapped on the front door, and sighing, she hurried away to answer it. The colour drained from her face when she found Flora's young man standing on the doorstep. He was very smartly dressed, and after respectfully removing his hat, he asked, "May I have a word with Flora, please?" Mrs. Merry was all of a dither as she stepped out onto the step to join him, closing the door softly, too, behind her. But I thought you'd gone home because your father was ill," she stammered. "I did, but thankfully he's much recovered now, so I felt it was safe to leave him and come and see Flora before she leaves." I'm afraid you're too late, young man. They've already gone." He looked confused. "But Flora told me they were sailing on the Titanic, and that doesn't leave until Wednesday," he said. Well, there was a change of plan, and they sailed on an earlier ship," she told him, feeling even more guilty as his face crumpled. "I see." He fingered the brim of his hat, looking devastated. "And did she leave no message for me? You did tell her I called, didn't you? Perhaps you could give me the address in New York where she'll be staying. I could write to her there, although she hasn't replied to any of the letters I've written so far." Mrs. Merry's heart was hammering so loudly now that she feared he must be able to hear it. Should Flora come back downstairs, now she would discover her deceit, and she didn't know how she would be able to bear the shame. "I'm very sorry." Her voice was firm now. "But Flora made it perfectly clear that she didn't wish to see or hear from you again, young man, so I'm afraid you are wasting your time here. Good day to you." But, please." She turned abruptly, stepping back into the hall, and closed the door firmly in his face. For a moment, she stood with her back flat to the door as her heartbeat slowed to a steadier rhythm. Then, as she headed for the dining room, she heard Flora's light footsteps on the stairs. "Was that someone at the door, Mary?" she asked. "Oh, just someone selling something," the woman said, keeping her voice steady, but guilt was eating away at her as an image of the young man's sad face flashed in front of her eyes. She saw Flora's devastated expression. She knew the girl had been hoping against hope that Jamie might still come before she and Connie left. But then, she consoled herself, Both he and Flora were young, with their whole lives in front of them. There would be plenty of time for them both to meet someone else they would care for, surely. Right now, Connie needed Flora to go with her to New York, after all she had been through. So she tried to convince herself that she had done the right thing. Chapter 6. Now, are you quite sure you've got everything? Mrs. Merry asked on the morning of their departure for at least the 10th time in as many minutes. Yes, I'm quite sure, Merry, Connie told her gently as she fastened her hat on with a large, lethal-looking hat pin. It was a fancy concoction in a dark purple, wide-brimmed and trimmed with ostrich feathers. She was wearing a deep purple two-piece costume in the latest fashion to go with it, which had a short jacket, a straight ankle-length skirt, and a smart white ruffled blouse. And have you got your belt safely on? Yes, Merry. Where did the time go? Mrs. Merry wondered as she fussed about the girl. It seemed like only yesterday that Connie had been just a little girl, and now here she was, a young woman, about to embark on the biggest adventure of her life so far. Standing beside her, Flora was also looking very smart in a cloche hat and a long-sleeved pale green day dress that Connie had given her to travel in. Cook was there as well and was sniffing noisily into a big white handkerchief. Later that day, she would be leaving to take up her new position in a big house on the outskirts of the town, but she had purposely waited to see her young mistress off. Outside, a horse-drawn cab was waiting to take them to the train station, where they would begin the first leg of their journey. The horse restlessly pawing the ground and snickering. So Connie gave Mrs. Merry and the cook one last gentle kiss on their cheeks. "Take care of yourselves," she said, her eyes full of tears. "And don't forget, Cook, when I come home, you can come back if you want to."
"I certainly shall. You needn't worry about that," Cook assured her as they all stepped outside. On the step, Connie paused and took one last glance back at the house that had been the only home she could remember. Then, with a sigh, she urged Flora towards the cab. Flora's parents would be waiting for them at the train station, and Flora didn't know if she was looking forward to seeing them one last time or dreading it. She knew how hard it was going to be, and hoped that she wouldn't break down when the time came for her and Connie to board the train. In no time at all, they were settled in the cab, and they hung out of the window and waved until Mrs. Merry and Cook were gone from sight. Connie leaned back against the leather squabs and sighed. "This is it, then," she said quietly, and Flora nodded. She had only been on a train once before, some years ago, when her parents had taken her and her siblings to Southend for the day, and she was looking forward to the journey with a mixture of emotions, sadness, excitement, and trepidation. Just as they had promised, Flora's parents were waiting on the platform when they arrived at the station. She had said her goodbyes to her brothers and sisters the Sunday before, and as Connie settled herself into a carriage, Flora placed her arms about them both. "Look after yourselves, do you hear?" She blinked back tears and forced a smile. "And just remember to write. Never forget I shall be back before you know it. 3 years will pass in no time." Her mother sniffed into a big white handkerchief as her father lifted her overnight bag onto the train. "You just be careful now," her mother told her in a wobbly voice as she clutched her daughter to her, as if she might never let her go. "And don't get venturing out on your own in that strange city." The porter blew his whistle then, and they heard the large engine chug into life. "Best climb aboard, love." Even her father's voice was choked as he pecked her on the cheek, and she scrambled aboard, closing the door behind her, then stood waving through the window as the train chugged out of the station. The journey from Waterloo Station was uneventful, although Flora did find it somewhat harrowing as she thought of leaving Jamie and all the people she loved far behind her. Would she ever see Jamie again, she wondered. If only he hadn't disappeared like that, she could have told him how much she loved him. She wished he'd given her just one more chance. But now it was too late, and her heart mourned at the thought of her lost love. Connie was quiet, so Flora spent most of the time watching the passing scenery from the window, and in the late afternoon the train drew into Southampton.
A porter quickly collected their luggage and loaded it onto a trolley for them, then led them to the exit, where a row of cabs was waiting for fares. "We're going to the Southwestern Hotel on the corner of Terminus Terrace and Canute Road," Connie told the porter as she consulted Mr. Wainthropp's list of instructions. He had been very explicit. "Ah, well, that's just down the way, miss," the kindly porter answered. "It's hardly worth getting in a cab if you don't mind a short walk. I'll bring this along for you and show you the way if you like." "That's very kind, thank you." Connie inclined her head. Then she and Flora set off at a trot, trying to keep up with him. At the hotel entrance, which was very impressive indeed, another young porter in a smart uniform rushed outside to lift their bags from the trolley, while Connie thanked their guide and gave him a handsome tip. "Thank you, miss." He doffed his cap. "Here for the launch of the Titanic, are you?" "We're sailing on her, actually," Connie informed him, and he whistled through his teeth. "Then I wish you a good journey, miss." He gave both girls a beaming smile and went off whistling merrily, trundling his empty trolley behind him. "Right, let's go and get booked in," Connie suggested, seeing that Flora was looking a little out of her depth. "Then I suggest we order some food to be sent up to our room. I could kill for a cup of tea right now. We could go out later on if you feel like it and have a look around." "Oh yes, I'd like that." Flora nodded as side by side they entered the magnificent hotel. The foyer was splendid and full of very wealthy-looking people dressed in the very latest fashions. "Miss Ogilvy and Miss Butler," Connie told the receptionist, as the woman quickly ran her finger down a list of names in a large register that stood open in front of her on a highly polished desk. "Ah, yes, Miss Ogilvy, here you are. You have adjoining rooms on the 3rd floor with a view of the docks. I do hope it's to your satisfaction. The porter will deliver your luggage to your rooms immediately, and a maid will be up shortly to unpack it for you. Is there anything else I can do for you?" "Yes, you could have a tray of tea for 2 sent up, and perhaps a selection of cakes," Connie answered confidently, and Flora gulped. This was like walking into another world. A glittering crystal chandelier hung in the centre of the foyer, and beyond it a sweeping staircase with a huge galleried landing led up to the 1st floor. The floor was covered in a thick wall-to-wall carpet that Flora's feet seemed to sink into, and everywhere she looked were tiny gilt-legged chairs and leather settees with well-dressed people taking afternoon tea on them. Connie and Flora followed the young porter to a lift that was set to one side of the foyer, and Flora got into it feeling nervous as the porter slammed shut the metal grille on the front of it. The next second, she felt as if she had left her stomach on the ground as it purred into life and began to ascend. But before she could comment on it to Connie, it slowed to a stop. "3rd floor, ladies." The young porter wheeled their trolley ahead of them, then, stopping in front of a door, he opened it for them and lifted their luggage into the room, before handing the key to Connie, who quickly slipped him a tip. Flora stared about her open-mouthed. "Wow!" she squeaked eventually as she ran to the window. "This is just beautiful. And look, Connie, that must be the Titanic there." She stabbed her finger towards the most enormous ship she had ever seen. "But she's huge. How will she ever manage to stay afloat?" Connie joined her at the window and grinned. The Titanic really was quite majestic and towered above the docks, making the other ships look like little rowing boats. The sailors standing on her decks, high against the skyline, looked like mere specks. "That's modern technology for you, but that must be your room through that door there. Do you want to take a peek?" Flora was off like a shot, and once again Connie heard her squeal with delight. There was a pale green carpet on the floor, and in the centre of one wall was a 4-poster bed. Chintz curtains to match the ones that hung at the window were hung about it, and there was a whole suite of matching furniture in a highly polished rosewood. "It's fit for a princess," Flora declared, as Connie joined her to take a look. "I never thought the day would ever come when I would stay in a hotel like this. It must have cost a fortune." Connie shrugged as she went back to her own room to check out another door that led to their own private bathroom. "Mr. Wainthropp has certainly done us proud," she admitted. "But then I can well afford it, so just enjoy your stay. If what they say is true, then our cabins aboard the Titanic will be just as lovely. They say she's like a floating hotel, and she's so big she could house the people of a whole town." Flora nodded as she peeped at the enormous ship from her bedroom window again. The docks below her were bustling with activity. Burly seamen were rolling barrels and all manner of things up gangplanks onto her, while many finely dressed people strolled by, keen to get a glimpse of what was reputed to be the world's first unsinkable ship. There was a tap at Connie's door, and a young maid appeared in a starched white mob cap, an apron trimmed with broderie anglaise, wheeling a tea trolley. "Shall I pour for you, miss?" "No, thank you. Just take it over to the chairs by the window, please." The young maid did as she was asked, then bobbed her knee and left as Connie and Flora took a seat each. For a moment, Flora gazed in admiration at the solid silver teapot, sugar bowl, and milk jug, before remembering her duty and straining the tea into 2 bone china cups that were so fine she could almost see through them. As they helped themselves to a selection of tiny cucumber sandwiches and small bite-sized cream cakes, Flora sighed with delight. "I swear this tea tastes better than any I've ever had," she told Connie with a sparkle in her eye. Despite her initial nervousness, she was beginning to feel excited now. As they were finishing, another maid appeared and quickly unpacked their night things for them before asking, "Will you be wishing me to unpack gowns for dinner, ladies? The restaurant is open from 7 till 10 o'clock each evening." Flora flushed. Connie had given her some beautiful dresses, but they were mostly day dresses. She didn't even possess an evening gown. "Yes, you can unpack the blue satin and the lilac chiffon." The maid quickly did as she was asked, and once the gowns were safely hung away in the armoire, she discreetly took her leave. "You can borrow my blue satin gown this evening," Connie told her. Flora shook her head. "Thank you, but I think I'll stay in my room," she mumbled. "I'd feel out of place down there with all those posh people, and I might let you down by using the wrong knife or fork or something." "Nonsense," Connie scolded. "All you have to do is remember to work from the outside of your cutlery in for each course. Just watch me. You have to eat, Flora, and that dress will suit your colouring perfectly. If you don't go down to dinner, then I can't," she added craftily. "It would be very unseemly for an unattached young woman to be seen dining alone." "Very well," Flora agreed reluctantly, knowing when she was beaten, and they both decided to rest for a while before going out to take a look at Southampton. As they strolled along the dock early that evening, the air was heavy with anticipation, as people clustered in groups to stare at the majestic ship. There was a nip in the air, so after a time the girls returned to the hotel to get ready for dinner. Flora would have much preferred to dine alone in her room, but knowing that Connie couldn't go down without her, she sat patiently while Connie tried to dress her hair, smiling to herself slightly at this reversal of roles. It was usually her dressing Connie's hair. "It's so thick, it seems to have a life of its own," Connie complained through a mouthful of pins. But eventually she managed to pile it on top of Flora's head and was clearly pleased with the results. "It makes you look much older and more sophisticated," Connie commented as she studied her efforts in the dressing table mirror. "But why can't I do yours for you as quickly as you do mine?" Flora chuckled. "Because I've had a lot more practice," she pointed out as she reached out for the dainty evening bag that Connie had lent to her. In the lovely blue gown, she felt like a princess and quite unlike herself, and it was a feeling she was sure she could get used to it. Suddenly, she wished Jamie could see her now. Would he regret running away from her if he could see her looking like this? The happy feeling continued down in the luxurious dining room as waiters served one delicious course after another. Connie merely picked at her food, but Flora ate everything that was put in front of her and enjoyed every mouthful. "I know you told me it's etiquette to leave a little on your plate, and I meant to," she whispered to Connie between courses, "but everything is so tasty that I cleared the plates without thinking." Connie gave her an indulgent smile. It was nice to see Flora enjoying herself. She had been her rock since she had lost her father, and Connie didn't really know how she would have got through things without her. She glanced around, feeling a little uncomfortable. They were both attracting more than a few admiring glances from the gentlemen in the restaurant, although Flora seemed oblivious to it, and Connie was glad when they could escape back to their rooms. After confining herself to the house following her father's death, she was finding it hard to be out in company again, although Flora was clearly loving every minute. Once they were back upstairs, Flora helped Connie prepare for bed, then went to her own room, where she tossed and turned as she thought of the adventure ahead. It was strange to think at this time the following day they would be out at sea, with their homeland far behind them. Her happy mood evaporated, and her eyes filled with tears, as she once again thought of her family and, inevitably, Jamie. She wished she could just forget about what had happened between them and how she had driven him away. But then, he could have come to see her at any time if he'd wanted to. In the end, he was the one who had moved away and left her unable to contact him. She hardened her heart. No, he'd made his decision and she had made hers, and now she was determined to see it through. After all, she reasoned, it's not forever, and on that calming thought, she eventually slept and dreamed of Jamie. Chapter 7. The sound of people on the docks woke Flora early the next morning, and hurrying out of bed she crossed to the window and drew aside the curtains. She had thought it was busy the night before, but that had been nothing compared to now. Already, passengers were pouring up the gangplanks to board the ship, and for a moment she panicked and wondered if they had overslept as she raced to the door adjoining Connie's room. She found Connie already up, and the girl smiled at her. "Hello, sleepyhead," she greeted her. "I've ordered breakfast to be brought up to us. I was just going to come and wake you." "I'm so sorry," Flora murmured sleepily, knuckling the sleep from her eyes. "I lay awake for ages, then when I did drop off I must have gone into a deep sleep." Connie shrugged. "It doesn't matter. We have plenty of time." The words had barely left her lips when there was a tap on the door, and a young, fresh-faced maid appeared with a trolley. "Full English and tea for two, miss." She smiled cheerily as she wheeled the trolley to a small table set in the window. "Would you like me to pour?" "No, thank you. I can do that," Flora assured her, and once the maid had gone, they began to lift the covers from the dishes. Flora had been sure after the enormous dinner she'd consumed the evening before that she wouldn't be able to eat again for at least a week, but suddenly she was hungry and did full justice to the meal. There was crispy bacon, fat juicy sausages, devilled kidneys, fried eggs and mushrooms. There was also toast and a huge pot of tea, and by the time she'd finished, she was sure that she was going to burst. "I'm afraid I've made rather a pig of myself again," she apologised, but Connie waved her hand airily. She herself had merely nibbled at a slice of toast, and even that had stuck in her throat. "That's what it's there for. But now if you've finished, we ought to get dressed." An hour later, they were ready to leave, and Connie summoned a porter to go to their room and collect their luggage. In no time at all, they were amid the thronging crowds on the dock as Connie rifled through their bags for their tickets. By then, a boat train from Waterloo had arrived, carrying passengers, and they joined the queue to board the ship. The vast majority of these were people emigrating to the United States, lured by the White Stars campaign promising a better life there. There was also a large number of crew who had been boarding the ship since 6:30 that morning, although Flora noticed they used a separate gangplank. Eventually they reached a deck, where each passenger was greeted by Captain Smith. Since deciding to sail on her, Connie had read every detail she could about the Titanic, so she knew already that he used to be the captain of the Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship. It reassured her that he clearly knew how to manage such an enormous ship. Connie and Flora were shown to their staterooms, which was so magnificent they took their breath away. They had wall-to-wall carpets and beautiful furniture and fittings. They even had their own private promenade deck, and Flora ran about inspecting everything as excited as a child. "I can't believe we're on a ship," she said, her eyes sparkling as she threw open the wardrobe doors. Their luggage had been sent on ahead, and already it had been neatly unpacked and hung. "That must be the door leading to your room there," Connie said, and sure enough, when Flora raced away to check, she found herself in another room almost as luxurious as Connie's. Oh, everything is just so beautiful, Flora crowed, throwing her arms out and dancing a little jig. Connie smiled indulgently as she strolled out onto the deck to watch the activity on the dock. It was heaving with people now who had come specially to see the Titanic off on her maiden voyage. A band was playing somewhere, and the air was buzzing with excitement. Connie and Flora set off, intent on exploring the ship, but realised in a very short time that it was going to take a while. It was absolutely enormous and divided into 3 sections for first, second, and third class passengers. In the centre of their section was the most magnificent staircase that Flora had ever seen. She stared in awe at the glass dome that sat above it, then hurried to catch up with Connie, who had continued on without her. The staircase ran from the top of the ship down 7 decks to the bottom, and the girls decided to go all the way to the bottom and work their way up. They peeped into the Turkish baths, and Flora was very taken with the open-air swimming pool. "Just imagine having a swimming pool aboard a boat," she gasped. They walked back up, and soon they found themselves in the dining saloon. The room itself was huge and decorated in the Louis XIV period, or so Connie said. But all Flora knew was that she could never have imagined such elegance and magnificence even existed. It was panelled from floor to ceiling in beautifully marked French walnut, in a delicate light brown colour, and all the mouldings and ornaments were richly carved and gilded. Large electric light brackets, fine chased in brass and gilt, and holding candle bulbs, were fixed along the entire length of the panelling, and Flora couldn't help but think of the gas mantles back in her mother's tiny house in Pleasant Row. There were huge bay windows, draped in fawn silk curtains with embroidered detail, with richly embroidered pelmets, and the floor was covered in a beautiful Axminster carpet that stretched from wall to wall. Small tables and chairs were laid out about the room, and elegant crystal lamps with rose-coloured shades illuminated each one. A bandstand, partly recessed and raised on a platform, stood at one end of the room, and on either side of it was a carved buffet table. "It's really hard to remember that we're on a ship, isn't it?" Flora mused as they walked back up to deck. Throughout the rest of the morning, passengers continued to come aboard, until finally the gangplanks were hauled away. Then, promptly, at 12 noon, as Connie and Flora stood on their private deck once more, 3 loud blasts of the Titanic's powerful whistles heralded her departure. A roar and a cheer went up from the people on the docks. Passengers were leaning over the ship's rails, waving wildly to the people they were leaving behind. Some were sobbing, and Flora felt tears prick at the back of her own eyes as she thought yet again of Jamie and her family. Slowly and smoothly, the enormous ship began to pull away, and very soon the people on the docks were merely dots in the distance. The first stop was to be Cherbourg in France, followed by Queenstown in Southern Ireland. From there it would be full steam ahead across the wide open waters of the Atlantic to New York. Once their homeland had disappeared from view, they set off to explore further. The movement of the ship was so smooth that Flora remarked it was hard to believe they weren't on dry land. There was so much to see that they barely knew where to start. They came across a large and spacious lounge decorated in the Georgian style, where friends could meet for a drink before going in to dine. At Connie's explanation, Flora rolled her eyes. At this rate, she'd know far more about furniture than she'd ever really wanted to. With elegant little settees and easy chairs upholstered tastefully in carmine-coloured silk that exactly complemented the carpet and the walls. Next, they went to peep into the shops, and were shocked to see that there was even a hairdresser. "Although I would much rather you do mine," Connie assured Flora. It was late that afternoon when they returned to their cabin to find that Connie had received an invitation to dine at the captain's table that evening. She knew that it was a great honour, but nevertheless she politely declined, explaining to the messenger that she was still in mourning for her father and wished to cause no offence. "I'll be sure to relay your message, miss," the young steward replied, and quietly slipped away. Flora frowned. She was thoroughly enjoying being in such opulent surroundings, and would have loved to dine with the captain, although of course she realised his invitation would not extend to maids, and, at the end of the day, that was what she still was. "You should start to move on with your life again. You can't stay in mourning forever," she gently pointed out. Connie shrugged. "That's easy for you to say, never having lost someone close who you loved dearly," she responded. Much to Flora's disappointment, after their initial exploration, Connie had stated that she was going to keep to her suite, and not wanting to leave her on her own, Flora stayed with her. But the following day, Flora grew restless from being cooped up. She was pacing on their private deck and listening to the hubbub around them, wishing she could see what was going on, when Connie said, "Why don't you go and have a wander around? I'm going to curl up with my book." She had borrowed The Lost World, written by Arthur Conan Doyle, from the ship's library, and was quite looking forward to a little peace and quiet, so that she could read it. Since boarding the ship, Flora had been so excited that she had chattered almost non-stop. "Well, if you're quite sure you don't mind, and you won't need me," Flora replied hesitantly. "I'm quite sure." Connie dropped onto a chair and put her feet up on a stool as if to prove the point, so Flora quickly went to find her bonnet, and after promising not to be gone too long, she set off. First, she went to peep through the window of the splendid first-class dining room, which she still considered was surely one of the most impressive rooms on the whole ship. She then went to watch the people playing squash for a while and took a stroll round the swimming pool. Next, she headed for the shops, swooning with envy as she saw some of the magnificent things for sale. The ship was clearly catering for the very wealthy, for most of the things cost more than she could earn in a whole year. Still, it was nice to gaze through the windows. As she was drooling over a ruby ring in the jeweller's shop window, she became aware of someone standing close behind her, and thinking that it was Connie come to join her, she swung about with a wide smile on her face. "I say, have you seen—" She stopped and blushed furiously as she found herself face to face with a tall, good-looking young gentleman. "Good afternoon, miss. I'm so sorry if I startled you." He swept his smart bowler hat off and gave a little bow as Flora's stomach did a little flip. "It's quite all right. I just thought you were someone else." Her voice came out as a squeak, and she blushed an even deeper shade of red. "Ah." His smile was infectious, and she found herself smiling back at him. "Are you enjoying the trip?" he asked genially, and she nodded. "Oh, yes, the ship is just—" She spread her hands as she tried to think of words that could describe it. "Just beautiful," she said eventually. She was captivated by his wonderful American accent. It was like nothing she had ever heard before. He glanced about the deck then, before asking, "Are you travelling alone?" She was so busy staring at him, taking in his thick dark hair and deep blue eyes, that she almost forgot to answer. "Oh, no," she stammered eventually. "I'm travelling with my mistress." "I see." He raised his eyebrow a little. He had assumed that because she was in the first-class area of the ship, that she was some rich young woman. But then, he asked himself, did it really matter if she was merely a maid? She was pretty in her own way, and could certainly help to pass the time on board. "Tobias Johnson at your service, Mom." He introduced himself with a gallant little bow. "Flora Butler," she muttered, as he gravely shook her hands. "Would you like to take a turn about the decks, Flora?" Her heart began to race and, afraid that she might make a fool of herself if she tried to answer, she merely nodded, as he crooked his arm for her to thread hers through. She hesitated for a second. It seemed very forward to stroll about with a young man when they had only just met, and a picture of Jamie flashed in front of her eyes. But Jamie had left her, and not even tried to contact her, she thought with a burst of anger. So what could be the harm in it? She asked herself. Seconds later, they were walking along looking for all the world like a young couple in love. It was still only April, and now that they were out on the open sea, there was a cruel bite in the air. But Flora hardly noticed it, as she peeped at her companion from the corner of her eye. He was certainly very handsome, and wealthy too, if the way he was dressed was anything to go by. "So, are you looking to holiday in America?" he asked after a time. Flora shook her head. "No, Mr. Johnson. My mistress is going to stay with her aunt in New York for 3 years." He squeezed her fingers, and her heart did a little somersault as he told her. "You must call me Toby. All my friends do, although my parents will never shorten my name." He chuckled. "I'm traveling with them now. My father has a number of businesses in London that he needed to visit, and seeing as I had nothing else on, I decided I would come with him and my mother." "Don't you have a job?" she asked innocently, and he chuckled. "Goodness me, no. Why would I work? My father is very wealthy indeed. I have a monthly allowance, and that, along with an inheritance from my late grandmother, ensures that I don't need to. Of course, when anything happens to my father, I'll probably have to take over the business, but until then I shall just concentrate on being young and enjoying myself." Flora secretly thought that this sounded very selfish, yet it didn't put her off him in the least. Admittedly, as she looked at her hand resting on his arm, she did feel a little pang of guilt again as she thought of Jamie, but she quickly pushed him from her mind. It was he who had left her after all, so why shouldn't she enjoy herself while she could? Toby began to tell her of his home and the horses he owned, and she hung on his every word. Every now and again, she felt she ought to pinch herself just to make sure that this was really happening. Who would ever have thought that a wealthy, well-brought-up young gentleman would ever look at the likes of her? But he had, and suddenly she wished that the journey could go on forever. But as it couldn't, she intended to make the most of every single minute of it. Chapter 8. "Flora? Flora! Whatever is the matter with you? It's as if you're in your own little world." "What? Oh, sorry, Connie, I was miles away." Flora apologised. "What was it you said?" "I asked 3 times, where is my bed jacket?" Connie frowned. "What's wrong with you? Are you feeling seasick or something?" "Oh, no, it's nothing like that." Flora hastily assured her as she crossed to a chest of drawers and immediately found what Connie wanted. "It's just, well, if you must know, I've met someone. A really lovely young man, as it happens." Connie frowned again as she saw the dreamy look in Flora's eyes. "Well, I hope you won't forget what you've come for, to keep me company," she griped. "Of course I won't." Flora was indignant now. "I just met him this afternoon, and only then because you wanted some quiet time and sent me out so you could read your book. Had you needed me, I wouldn't even have gone out. You know I wouldn't." "Sorry," Connie said, feeling guilty now. "And of course you need some time to yourself too. But do be careful. I mean, this man could be anybody. Is he from the steerage passengers?" "As it happens, he and his parents have a suite of rooms like this in first class." Flora's chin came up as she gazed at Connie, as if daring her to dispute it. "Oh, I see." Connie gazed back at her solemnly. "Then just be careful all the same. We are 2 young women travelling on our own, and you know what Mr. Wainthropp said, trust no one." Flora pursed her lips and started to prepare the table ready for their meal. She desperately longed to go to the sumptuous dining room, but Connie was still insisting that their meals were served in their room. Still, she thought, she'd taken to going to bed early since she'd lost her father, so it might be possible to slip out and see Toby later that evening. He had hinted that he might take a stroll along the promenade deck before retiring. Just as she had hoped, Connie was settled in bed with her book by 9 o'clock, so Flora hurriedly slipped away to her own room and brushed her hair till it shone. She put her cape and bonnet on and tiptoed out into the cold night air. She could hear music coming from the direction of the dining room and was lured to the sound like a moth to a flame. Through the window, she could see elegant women wearing stunning gowns in all the colours of the rainbow, seated next to gentlemen who dressed in formal black dinner suits that made them look like the pictures of penguins she had seen in books. Every woman seemed to be dripping in jewels, as if they were trying to outdo each other, and they flashed in the lights of the sparkling crystal chandeliers. Huge vases of exotic-looking flowers were dotted about the edges of the room, and although she was outside, she could imagine how beautiful they must smell. She was so taken with the sight that when Toby came up behind her and gently placed his hand on her arm, she almost jumped out of her skin.
"Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you,"
he grinned.
"I thought it was you staring through the window. Why don't you come in?"
He, too, was wearing a dark evening suit, complemented by a crisp white shirt and a black dicky bow, and he looked very suave and sophisticated. "Oh, I'm not really dressed for it," she muttered, staring down at her plain day dress. It was one of Connie's old ones, and by far the best she had ever owned, but she knew that she would stand out like a sore thumb if she were to walk into the dining room in it, and felt deeply embarrassed.
"For what it's worth, I think you look quite delightful,"
he told her smoothly, making hot colour burn in her cheeks.
"But if you don't feel comfortable coming inside, why don't we take advantage of the music and have a dance out here?"
"Here?" She stared around the deserted deck. It was far too cold for many people to want to venture outside, and her breath was hanging in the air in front of her like fine lace. Even so, when he placed his arm about her waist, heat flooded through her. The band were playing a waltz, and she lowered her eyes as she told him, I'm not really much good at dancing."
"Then I'll teach you,"
he told her, raising her hand into his. Very gently he began to lead her, and as she stared up into his handsome face, she did her best to match her steps to his.
"There you are,"
he teased.
"You're a natural."
Very soon they were gliding along the deck, and Flora felt as if she was floating and wished that it could go on forever. The moon was turning the sea to liquid silver, and the night took on a magical air. However, after a time, he told her regretfully,
"I suppose I should be getting back in now. My parents will wonder where I've got to. Are you sure you won't come in?"
Flora came back down to earth with a bump as she hastily stepped away from him. Whatever would his parents think of her? A maid? "No, thank you. I ought to get back to make sure that Connie doesn't need anything."
"Very well. Then hopefully I shall see you at some point tomorrow, Flora. Good night."
Before she knew what was happening, he bent his head, and as his lips lightly brushed hers, her heart started to hammer so loudly in her chest that she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Good night, Toby." He gave her a courteous little bow, and she stood as if rooted to the spot until he disappeared back through the doors. When he was gone, she raised her hand to touch her lips, and just for a second, she thought of the kisses she'd shared with Jamie. But she pushed the thought away. He'd made his choice when he ran away. So, smiling to herself, she hurried back to her room, where she sat shivering and staring through the cabin window at the stars overhead, reliving every second of the evening in her mind.
End of CD 2. CD 3.
The following morning at breakfast, Connie remarked, "You're very quiet today. Are you feeling unwell?" "Not at all." Flora helped herself to another fried egg. All this fresh air was giving her an enormous appetite. "On the contrary, I feel wonderful. Who wouldn't aboard such a lovely ship? Why don't you come for a stroll this morning? You're looking a little pale and the fresh air will do you good." "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to take a turn around the deck, but we'll have to wrap up warmly. It seems to be getting colder by the minute. The steward who bought my cocoa last night said we could be seeing icebergs in another day or so." As Flora laid Connie's clothes out for her, she groaned as she saw the belt that Mrs. Merry had made for her. "Do I have to wear that again? It's rubbed all the skin round my middle." "Mine has too," Flora admitted, "but I've worn it religiously, just as I promised her I would." Connie's jewels and papers were evenly spread between the two belts. "Let's just hide them in here for today. It's hardly likely that anyone is going to come in and steal them, is it?" Mary was so worried that I might forget my aunt's address, but I swear it's burned into my brain even if I were to lose it. Mine too, Flora admitted, and promptly pushed both of the belts into the bottom of the wardrobe and covered them with a carpet bag. There. She stood back up and rubbed her hands together with a satisfied sigh. It will be nice not to have it digging into me every time I sit down for a while. They set off for a brisk walk along the promenade. The first-class deck was decorated in a Tudor style. For once, Flora recognised this, and stretched all along the side of the ship, with comfortable padded chairs set down the length of it, where wealthy women in expensive-looking fur coats sat sipping coffee and chatting. The deck was under cover, but it was still bitterly cold as the girls stood at the rails looking out at the vast expanse of the ocean. They walked up and down for a little while, until, by mid-morning, Flora persuaded Connie to go into one of the many salons leading from it. The fragrant aroma of coffee greeted them the second they stepped through the door, and they had barely had time to find a seat when a waiter in a snow-white jacket with a little towel folded neatly across his arm hurried over to take their order. "Yes, ladies, what may I get for you?" He purred respectfully, and Connie gave him their order. "Ah, this is the life," Flora remarked, her cheeks pink from the cold air outside. "I could get used to being waited on like this." "Instead of you having to wait on me, you mean?" Connie asked with a grin. "No, I didn't mean that at all. I love working for you," Flora told her. "But that doesn't mean to say that I can't make the most of it, does it? We've been sailing for 2 days already. The voyage will be over before we know it, so I'm going to make the most of every minute." They enjoyed coffee and fresh-baked biscuits, and Connie watched Flora tuck in with amusement. "You'll be the size of a house by the time we get to New York at this rate," she teased. "I know." Flora managed to spray crumbs all down the front of her dress. "I really should stop eating so much, but everything is so tasty." At that moment, a heavily made-up middle-aged woman and a gentleman went by them, and leaning towards Connie, Flora whispered, "Do you suppose that's a real mink coat she's wearing?" Connie nodded. "Undoubtedly. There are some very rich people aboard. She's probably got a wardrobe full of them. Blimey." The word slipped out before she could stop it, and Flora glanced at Connie apologetically. Soon after, they embarked on another tour of the ship, this time to the tennis courts. But as lunchtime approached, they made their way back to their rooms. "I'm not really hungry, but get the steward to bring you anything you want," Connie told her. "I'm going to lie on my bed and read for a while." Flora spent a restless hour pacing up and down. She longed to go and see if she could track Toby down, but didn't dare to in case Connie needed anything. She was supposed to be there to cater to her every need after all, although the maids and steward seemed to be doing a very good job of that. All she was really needed for was to arrange Connie's hair and help her with dressing and undressing. It wasn't until Connie was settled that evening that she managed to get out again, and once more she headed for the dining room to stare through the windows, hoping for a sight of Toby. Once again, she was mesmerised as she stared at the women in their beautiful gowns and listened to the sound of the orchestra. The dining room was quite stunning, with huge marble pillars that reached right up to the ceiling, and with the beautiful sweeping staircase rising up from it, the entire scene looked like it had come straight out of a fairy tale. "I hope you're looking for me." The voice made her spin around, and when she saw Toby standing there, her face lit up. "I was hoping you'd come," he said. Taking her hand, he began to lead her away. Soon she was completely lost as they climbed up to the upper decks, but still she followed him trustingly until they came to the lifeboats, where he dragged her into the shadows. "I know what girls like you want," he said, as his arms came tightly about her, and the first feelings of panic fluttered to life in her stomach. Where was the knight in shining armour who had held her tenderly in his arms and danced the night away with her the night before? He had backed her up tight to one of the lifeboats, and now his hands began to roam up and down her body. "What are you doing?" she snapped indignantly as she tried to thrust him away. "And what exactly do you mean, girls like me?" "Now don't be a tease." His mouth was pressed against her ear, and she began to struggle. "Toby, stop it this minute, do you hear me?" she yelped. but he appeared to have gone deaf as he thrust his hand into her cape and viciously squeezed her breast. "I shall scream if you don't stop," she warned him, and when he ignored her and carried on groping, she brought her knee up with all the force she could muster, catching him right between the legs. It was a little tip her brother had taught her years ago if ever she found herself in just this position. He instantly doubled over and reeled away from her as she hastily stepped around him and attempted to straighten her hat, which was all askew. "You are no gentleman, sir," she spat as she sailed past him. But inside, she was crying. How could I have been so foolish as to trust him? She berated herself. Men like him felt that girls from the lower classes like me are just there to be used and abused. Didn't Connie try to warn me? But I was so swept away with him and so flattered at his attention that I wasn't thinking straight. "Well, I certainly won't make that mistake again," she promised herself, feeling dirty and humiliated as she raced back to her room without once looking back. She couldn't help thinking how different Toby was to Jamie. Not once in all the time she had known him had Jamie ever attempted to abuse her, nor had he ever treated her with anything other than loving respect. But then Jamie was a true gentleman. She realised now that she had only responded to Toby's attentions because she was trying to forget the way Jamie had abandoned her, not that she could blame him. And once again, she felt bereft. "What a difference a day makes," Connie remarked the next morning as Flora poured the tea. "You were on top of the world yesterday about your new beau, but this morning you look as if the end of the world is nigh. What's wrong?" "Nothing. I just have a slight headache, and I thought on what you said and decided that I perhaps didn't want to see him again after all," Flora replied sulkily. She was far too humiliated to tell Connie the truth. "That must have been the shortest romance in history," Connie answered, raising an eyebrow inquisitively. But Flora remained stubbornly silent. "But at least I've learned a lesson," Flora told herself silently, and tried to go on as if nothing had happened. It had been a very hard lesson indeed. Chapter 9. Connie and Flora were strolling along the promenade later that day when, to her horror, Flora saw Toby heading towards them with an older couple who she assumed were his parents. The woman was wearing a long, fur-trimmed coat, and the man looked like an older version of Toby. She flushed and averted her eyes, but as they drew abreast of them, Toby raised his hat and gave Connie a dazzling smile.
"Good morning, ladies."
"Good morning," Connie answered, and Flora's humiliation was complete. He hadn't even glanced at her. "He was a very charming, handsome young man," Connie remarked when they had passed him. Flora didn't reply. She had no intention of telling her that he was the man she'd been sneaking out to meet. She just hoped that she would never have to clap eyes on Tobias Johnson again. The weather had turned even more bitterly cold now, and here and there they could see icebergs towering out of the sea. "Let's get back into the warm," Connie suggested a few moments later. "It's far too cold to be out here." Flora was only too happy to oblige. The extreme change in temperature and the towering icebergs that jutted out of the sea were making her feel nervous. That, on top of seeing Toby, made her feel that the whole trip was ruined for her, and she could hardly wait for them to dock in New York now. They spent the rest of the day in their rooms, reading and resting, and Flora was glad when it was time for them to retire. The next day, it seemed even colder, and they ventured no further than the ship's library, but luckily, they didn't bump into Toby again. "Just a few more days and we'll be in New York," Flora commented as she brushed Connie's hair for her that night before they retired. Connie nodded. She too would be glad when the journey was over now. She was bored. Flora went to bed at about 10:30 after making sure that Connie no longer needed her, and for the first time since they had sailed, she fell asleep almost instantly. Suddenly, she was jolted awake. Glancing at the clock, she saw that it was 11:45. There was a loud, piercing, grinding noise that seemed to go right through her and set her teeth on edge, and she felt the ship shudder. She lay for a moment, eyes wide and staring into the darkness, wondering what on earth had happened. Slowly, she became aware that the engine noise that had been in the background since the ship had set sail had fallen silent. Had the engine stopped? Throwing back her covers, she jumped out of bed and rushed into Connie's room, where she found her awake too. "Did you hear something?" Connie asked fearfully as she peeped over the top of the bedclothes. "Yes, it was like a grinding noise, and I can't hear the engines. I felt the ship shudder too. What do you think has happened?" Connie shrugged as she swung her legs out of the bed. "I have no idea, but it can't be anything serious, can it? They have said this ship is unsinkable, haven't they?" There were noises outside in the corridor then, and the girls crept to the door and peeped out to see what was happening. A steward was trying to reassure other passengers who had been awakened and was streaming out into the corridors in their nightclothes. "There's nothing to worry about whatsoever," they heard him say. "We have hit an iceberg, but it just means it might take us a few more days to reach New York than planned." Flora glanced at Connie and noticed that she had gone terribly pale, and she looked terrified. "Come on now, don't start panicking. You heard what he said," Flora urged, squeezing her arm reassuringly, although her own heart was beating alarmingly hard. "But let's get dressed, eh? We can go up on deck then and see what's going on." "I'll get dressed, but I'm not leaving my room," Connie retaliated in a wobbly voice. An awful feeling of foreboding had come over her, and she couldn't seem to control it. Both of them hurriedly got dressed, then sat together holding hands, listening to the sound of footsteps hurrying up and down the passageway outside. People were clearly panicking, and they could hear them firing questions at the staff. "Why have the engines stopped? What's happening?" At that time, the staff were obviously trying to calm them, but as the minutes passed, the sound of doors slamming and running footsteps intensified until suddenly someone hammered on the door and shouted, "Get your lifebelts and some warm clothes on, and get up on deck immediately." "The squash court in the baggage bay is already submerged," someone screamed, and now Connie started to tremble. We're going to die," she whimpered, but Flora gently shook her. "No, we are not. Now come along. We'd best get the belts on that Mrs. Merry made us, then we'll get our lifebelts on." She instantly began to rummage beneath the bags in the wardrobe. Then, slinging the first belt that came to hand at Connie, she quickly hoisted her skirt and fastened the second one around her own waist. Connie did the same, although it took her longer because her hands were trembling so much. Then they grabbed their coats and let themselves out into the hallway, where they were immediately swept along by a tide of terrified people. Most of the women were crying, and the men were doing their best to comfort them as Connie clung to Flora's hands. Once up on deck, Flora's hand rose to her throat, and she suddenly realized that she had left the little silver locket that Jamie had given her in their cabin. It was the only thing she had to remember him by, and she desperately wanted to go back and get it. But the ceaseless jostling of the passengers behind her made her realize there was no way she could make it. Anyway, she couldn't leave Connie. As the crowd jostled up the stairs to the lifeboat deck at the top of the ship, they passed the purser's office. Glancing through the door, Flora caught a glimpse of piles of papers and valuables laid out on a desk, and a crowd of people were clamouring to retrieve their valuables. Suddenly, for the first time, she realised that they were indeed in mortal danger, and she grasped Connie's hand, partly to reassure herself and partly to ensure she wouldn't lose her in the crush of people. When they finally emerged onto the deck, the cold air hit them like a slap in the face, almost taking their breath away. An officer stepped forward to help them adjust their lifebelts before pushing them none too gently in the direction of the lifeboats, which had already been uncovered. Still holding tight to Connie's hand, Flora looked at them in dismay. "Is this all there is?" she wondered. "Surely there aren't enough boats for everyone on board." She looked around, hoping to see some other boats hidden somewhere, but there was just the press of screaming, shivering passengers. Maybe there was some lifeboats stowed on another deck as well, she thought hopefully. She didn't dare voice her thoughts aloud, though. Connie was in a bad enough panic as it was, and, to be honest, for the first time since she had woken up, Flora was beginning to feel that maybe everything wouldn't be all right. In addition to the screams of the other passengers and Connie's sobbing, now they were at the top of the ship. There was a ceaseless, deafening roar of escaping steam, which they hadn't been aware of while they were inside. It added to the sheer terror of the scene, and was too much for Connie, who pulled her hand from Flora's and put both hands over her ears, screaming, "Make it stop! Make it stop!" Not sure what to do, Flora grabbed her hands and pulled Connie in close, whispering soothingly in her ear, "Shh, now. We'll be safe soon. Don't you worry, my darling. It's all going to be fine." She hoped Connie couldn't hear the trembling in her voice, because right then, Flora was not convinced that anything would be all right again. Gradually, Connie quietened and the girls stood with their arms wrapped around each other and watched wide-eyed as the seamen worked frantically to prepare the boats to be lowered. Finally, the first one was ready to be hoisted out on long ropes and dangled beside the ship. People were screaming and wailing all around them, and the girls were swept forward in the panic-stricken crowd as the sailors shouted for women and children to come forward. Soon they were hanging onto the rail, staring down into a lifeboat that was rocking precariously from side to side. "I can't get in that!" Connie cried in terror as she gazed down into the black sea far below, and before Flora could stop her, she was off, racing like a hare back the way they had come. Somehow, Flora pushed and shouldered her way through the crowd until eventually she caught up with her just as she was about to launch herself into the passage leading back to their staterooms. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she cried furiously as she caught Connie roughly by the arm and swung her about. "If you go back in there and the ship goes down, you'll bloody well go down with it, you fool!" Suddenly, all the elocution lessons she had had from Connie were forgotten, and she was just a young, frightened girl from the docks in Whitechapel. Connie was fighting her and moaning deep in her throat, so Flora brought her hand back and landed a glancing blow on her young mistress's cheek. Connie was so shocked that she stopped whimpering immediately, and now that Flora had her attention, she barked, "We have to get off the ship, do you understand? If we don't, you may well die. Now what are you going to do? Because I'll tell you now, I'm going to get into one of those boats while I still can." Connie gulped, her terrified eyes huge in her pale face, but at least she was calmer now. I'll come." "Good." Flora grabbed her arm again and dragged her back to the deck, but it was clear they had lost their chance. The crowd trying to escape was twice as big as it had been, and people were elbowing each other out of the way as they tried to secure places in the lifeboats. "Stand back now, women and children only, do you hear me?" a seaman's voice yelled. Once full, the other lifeboats were being swung out prior to being lowered, but because it was dark, it was impossible to see how many people were in them. "Come on, let's try the deck below," Flora yelled to make herself heard above the noise of the crowd, and grabbing Connie's hand, she hauled her along until they came to the steps leading down to B-deck below. The same mayhem was happening there, as sailors held off the men and pushed and shoved the nearest women and children into the boats. Somehow, Connie and Flora found themselves right next to a boat, and a sailor quickly grabbed Flora around the waist and unceremoniously threw her inside it. She landed in an undignified heap in the bottom of it, and after struggling to her knees, she looked round desperately for a sight of Connie. On one of the decks, the band had started to play, to try to allay the people's panic, and Flora thought how brave they were, as hands reached out to help her onto the cold plank seat. Then suddenly, a young, poorly dressed woman clad only in a thin shawl despite the bitterly cold night, who looked as if she might have come from the steerage section of the boat, threw something into Flora's arms. And as Flora glanced down, she realised with horror that it was a tiny baby. "Look out for her for me, miss. God bless you," the woman shouted as the sailor pushed her back to make way for Connie. Connie also landed awkwardly in the boat, but as she stood up, another woman was lowered in, and somehow she lost her balance. The next few seconds would remain engraved in Flora's mind forever, For as she stretched out a hand to help Connie, the back of the girl's leg struck the side of the boat and she teetered as she tried desperately to right herself before plunging backwards over the side, down into the deep, dark sea below. "No!" Flora's scream echoed across the waves, but as she made to stand, many hands pushed her back down onto her seat again. "Sit still, or you'll have us all capsize," someone threatened, as tears began to stream down Flora's cheeks and drip onto the baby in her arms. "There's no help for your friend now, God rest her soul. She stands no chance after a fall like that into the sea." "No, let me see. I've got to find her. Oh, God, I can't let her go. Take the baby, please. I need to find her." The woman beside her put an arm around her and held her firmly. "For God's sake, don't be such a fool, girl. Think of that poor baby. You'd give up your child to find your friend? Sit down and be quiet before you kill us all." Sobbing uncontrollably, Flora knew the woman was speaking sense. But how could she sit here and do nothing? After everything Connie had done for her, it would be a betrayal to just leave her to her fate. And how would she ever live with herself if she didn't try to do something? But what choice did she have? She could hand the baby to someone else and go after Connie, but she would surely die. She looked down at the baby, then back at the water, hanging over the side of the boat as far as she dared, and searching in vain for a sight of Connie in the seething black water below. But there were so many poor souls already thrashing about down there that it was impossible to find her. At that moment, the baby began to wail too, and all Flora could do was rock her helplessly as she tried to take in what had happened. Just seconds before, Connie had been there with her, and now she could be gone forever, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. It was just too much to take in. Soon after, the boat began to rock dangerously as it was lowered into the waves below, and Flora clung to the side with one hand while she gripped the baby with her other, still desperately searching the water for a sight of her friend as tears streamed down her cold face. The boat hit the water with a splash, and the oarsmen quickly released the lowering ropes and started to row frantically. Thankfully, once they had managed to steer the boat clear of the thrashing waters around the ship, the sea was calm, giving no hint of the freezing treachery that lay beneath the surface. Above them, countless stars shone down onto the icebergs, making them glisten like diamonds to match the ones that the women from the first-class cabins were decked in, and everything began to take on an air of unreality. Flora screamed Connie's name over and over again, making the child in her arms sob even harder as she continued to look for any sign of her dear friend. She reasoned that if only she could spot her, they could somehow pull her aboard the boat. But another little voice in her head said that perhaps she had been sucked beneath the sea. Suddenly, an SOS flare flamed up into the sky, illuminating the ship for just long enough for the people on the lifeboat to see that the unsinkable Titanic was indeed actually sinking. Vaguely, Flora could see other lifeboats around them, but it was far too dark to see how many people were aboard them. And still, the haunting strains of a waltz floated across the water from the deck, making the whole scene seem unreal. "This can't be happening," Flora thought. "I'm having a nightmare, and when I wake up I shall be back in the staterooms with Connie safe and sound." But she knew all too well that it was real. The baby in her arms was crying harder now, but apart from gently rocking her, Flora could do nothing for her. Teeth chattering, she slipped the tiny child inside her coat to try to keep her warm, but she wasn't sure it would work. She was chilled to the bone, and she could see that everyone else in the boat was also shivering. "God willing, a ship will see the flare and come to our rescue," an elderly lady said, and a murmur of agreement rippled through the passengers. "Well, it had better come soon, or it will be too late for the poor souls left aboard. Look, it's split in two. People are jumping into the water," someone said, and Flora watched in horror as the great ship slowly began to sink beneath the waves. It was as if some great unseen hand had come and cleaved it neatly in two with a gigantic axe. Then the lights went out, and they were plunged into darkness. Even from a distance, the sound of terrified people screaming could be heard, and now wreckage from the ship was beginning to spread across the surface of the sea. People in the water were trying to cling to it to keep afloat, but it was painfully obvious that they couldn't survive for long in the freezing water. "Turn back, for God's sake!" one woman implored the rowers. "We could get at least 6 more people aboard this boat." "Yes, and I need to look for my mistress," Flora added. But the rowers never slackened the oars. "If we turn back, they'll all be trying to climb aboard, and we'll overturn and then we'll die and all," the younger of the two said. Flora screwed her eyes shut to block out the terrible sight that was being played out before her. People were slipping and jumping into the sea, only to be instantly sucked under by the fast-sinking ship, and the sounds of their screams echoed hollowly across the water. "We are in God's hands now. Let us pray," an elderly lady whispered, and mechanically, Flora began to recite the Lord's Prayer. "Our Father, who art in heaven." Chapter 10. It was some minutes later when a frail old lady who was sitting next to Flora stood up and sobbed. "I can't bear it. I have to go back. My Arthur was on that boat. I must get to him." "Sit down, or you'll have us all overboard," the seaman hissed as the boat began to rock precariously. But she simply stood there for a moment and gave him the sweetest smile. "But you don't understand, young man," she said softly. "We've been married for nearly 50 years. I have to find him. We're a pair." And with that, she plunged into the water before anyone could stop her. "No!" Flora made a grab for the back of the old lady's coat, but already the poor soul was moving away from the boat. She had gone no more than a few yards when the weight of her clothes began to pull her under, and within seconds there was nothing to be seen of her as she sank into the depths. Flora bowed her head and offered a silent prayer that a boat might come to rescue them soon. Already, dead bodies could be seen floating amongst the wreckage, and she shut her eyes again so that she wouldn't have to look any more, and silently willed the distressed baby in her arms to stop crying. Soon after, she found that she couldn't open her eyes again even if she had wanted to. Her tears had turned to ice, and her eyelids were frozen shut. Strangely, she had gone past feeling cold now. In fact, she felt hot, and as she drifted off to sleep, she sighed and welcomed the darkness and the eerie silence. "Wake up, that's it." From far away, Flora heard a voice, and as she tried to blink her eyes open, she became aware that someone was leaning over her. "Where am I?" she asked blearily, and struggled to sit up, but gentle hands pushed her back against soft pillows.
"It's all right. You're aboard the Carpathia. We got a distress call from the Titanic and came as quickly as we could."
Flora blinked, confused. But where was Connie? And what did he mean, a distress call? And then it all came flooding back to her, and she began to cry. The baby! Where's the baby?" She was staring up into the face of a kindly white-haired gentleman with little gold spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He was dressed in a white jacket, and she guessed that he must be the ship's doctor.
"Shh, we won't talk about that for now,"
he soothed, but Flora wouldn't be put off. "But I must know where she is," she mumbled, as her head thrashed from side to side. "Her mother entrusted her to me."
"Ah, she wasn't your baby then?"
"Of course not. Now tell me where she is. She was upset. She wouldn't stop crying. And then after a time she went very quiet and she didn't wake up again."
"I'm very sorry, my dear. The baby didn't make it," he told her gently. "It was the cold, you see. She was already dead when we took her from your arms. Do you know what her name was?"
"No."
Tears spilled out of Flora's eyes. She hadn't made a very good job of taking care of the child, had she? And Connie. Poor Connie. She wanted to ask more questions, but she was so tired and her chest felt as if it was on fire. She was hot and cold all at the same time. And then the darkness was rushing towards her again, and she gave herself up to it gladly. It was 24 hours before Flora next opened her eyes, and when she did, she found that she was as weak as a kitten. Turning her head, she saw that they were in a large room with row upon row of people lying on mattresses on the floor and huddled into blankets. A young nurse hurried up to her. "Are you awake again, then?" She smiled as she took Flora's pulse. "You gave us quite a scare back there. I don't mind telling you, miss. You've had a raging fever, but luckily it's broken now, so you should start to recover. Come on, have a little drink." She gently lifted Flora's head from the pillow, and as she trickled water between her chapped, dry lips, Flora was sure that nothing had ever tasted sweeter. She was aware then that she was dressed in a long, thick nightgown. As if reading her mind, the nurse told her, "Don't worry, your clothes are safe, and so is the belt you were wearing about your waist. From that we were able to identify you, Miss Ogilvy. There was an address inside the belt, presumably of the people you were going to visit, and they've been sent word of when we're likely to dock, so that they can come and meet you." "But I'm not... No." Flora clamped her mouth shut. This young nurse thought that she was Connie, but... "It's all right, don't get distressed," the nurse said before Flora could go on. "You've had a terrible shock, but things will get easier." Flora lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, as tears coursed down her cheeks. Connie was gone. There was nothing she could have done to save her, and she could never come back. But Connie had had someone waiting for her at the end of the journey, whereas she had no one. She had merely been Connie's maid, so what was to become of her now? Connie's aunt would have no allegiance to her, and she would be in a foreign country with no money, no friends, and no way of getting home. It was a terrifying thought. But then an idea occurred to her. What if she were to become Connie? Her aunt hadn't seen Connie since she was just a babe in arms, to the best of her knowledge. So how would she know if she were to pose as her niece? She dismissed the ludicrous idea almost immediately. It was ridiculous and deceitful. And then her eyes became heavy again, and she slept once more. When she next awoke, it was morning again, and she felt a little better, although she was still very weak, and she had developed a terrible cough. "Get some of this into you," the same young nurse who had tended to her the day before urged, as she helped her up onto her pillows and placed a tray with a dish of porridge and a cup of hot sweet coffee in front of her. The porridge was heavily laced with sugar, but it tasted like grit, and it stuck in her sore throat, although she did manage to drink some of the coffee. "Well, at least you managed a little bit," the nurse said approvingly when she came back a few minutes later to remove the tray and take her temperature. "And your temperature has gone down slightly as well," she told her. "Now, do you feel well enough to get up and sit in a chair for a while?" "I think so," Flora croaked. Her chest was still burning, and her head and throat ached too. The nurse assisted her to the bathroom first, and by the time they got back, and Flora had been settled into a chair, she was exhausted. "Feeling better, dear?" Flora glanced at the lady next to her. She looked quite frail, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Yes, thank you," Flora answered politely, and the woman promptly burst into tears. "Forgive me," she spluttered as she mopped at her streaming eyes with a large white handkerchief. "I know I should be grateful that we survived, but it was all so... She shook her head as if that would somehow miraculously wipe out the terrible images behind her eyes. My husband and son and his young family were on the boat with me. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, but they all went down with the ship." "I'm so sorry." The words seemed inadequate, but Flora could think of nothing else to say. "And you, dear, did you lose anyone?" "Yes, my maid," Flora faltered. The second the lie had left her mouth, Flora clamped her lips together. Her heart was beating so loudly that she was sure the lady must be able to hear it. She knew that if she were to embark on this lie, there could be no turning back, and it terrified her. And yet, she asked herself, wasn't the thought of being all alone thousands of miles from home even more terrifying? "I'm Mrs. Willis," the old lady chattered on. "What's your name, dear?" Flora gulped and licked her lips, which had suddenly gone dry. "I'm Miss Constance Ogilvy. I was on the way to stay with my aunt in New York when—" And so the lie began. "It's all right. You don't have to talk about it if it's too painful," the old lady said sympathetically. "You're still in shock, and you've been very poorly. But things will get easier. You'll see." Flora nodded numbly and closed her eyes, eager to escape any more talk. She had a lot of thinking to do now. Over the course of that day, Flora learned from the nurses that there were only 705 survivors from the Titanic aboard the Carpathia. The majority of them women and children. Over 1,500 people had perished in the icy seas. She shuddered to think of the poor souls, and wept when she thought of the poor little baby who had been entrusted to her care. If only she could have saved her. She was told that the officers of the White Star Line in both New York and Southampton had been deluged with terrified friends and relations, all waiting to hear a list of the survivors as they prayed that their loved ones were amongst them. It was only then that she suddenly thought of her family, and her heart sank. If she was to take on Connie's identity, her parents and siblings would believe she was dead, and they would be heartbroken. Her mother had never wanted her to go to New York in the first place, and knowing her as she did, Flora was sure that she would blame herself for not stopping her. But on the other hand, she reasoned that if she did go ahead with her plan, she could send them money regularly, which would help their financial position no end. Later that evening, as she was still wrestling with her conscience, the patients in the ship's makeshift hospital were informed that they should be arriving in New York late the following day. Flora was relieved, and sure that if she could only get off the Carpathia safely, she would never sail again. The next day, although still weak, Flora dressed in the clothes that had been returned to her and joined the rest of the survivors from around the ship. At 8:20 p.m. that evening, the rescue ship arrived opposite her dock. It was a wild and windy night outside the harbour, and as the ship sailed up the channel, it was surrounded by a heavy fog. It was raining, and at intervals lightning lit up the sky. Crowds had begun to gather in the vicinity of the docks long before it got dark, and as time passed it became larger and larger. Over 300 police had been drafted in to stretch ropes across the streets leading to the pier, and the crowd was halted at 11th Avenue and allowed to go no further. Inside the lines were many automobiles and ambulances. Relatives of the survivors were gathered on Pier 54, but it was eerily quiet as they waited apprehensively for a sight of their loved ones. The only sound was the relentless beating of the rain and the surge of the tide. Next to the relatives was a knot of undertakers who would have the unhappy job of removing the dead who had been pulled from the sea to their premises, and they were joined by white-uniformed ambulance surgeons who were prepared to minister to those survivors who were still ill or injured and transport them to the nearest hospitals if necessary. Over 500 black-garbed Sisters of Mercy and a score of priests also stood ready to reunite the survivors with their relatives whenever they could. There was an air of tense expectancy, as everyone was informed that the Carpathia had passed Pier 59, where they had dropped off the empty lifeboats. But still, no one moved from the places they had been assigned to. It was a very sorrowful assembly. At last, at 9:55 p.m., the first 3 women passengers walked down the gangplank, followed by a sailor and a man in a big brown raincoat and a soft hat. Then came other survivors, and it was instantly obvious that most of them had lost their own clothes and were wearing whatever the passengers of the Carpathia had been able to provide them with. 2 poor women, who appeared to be violently insane, were carried from the ship, while others appeared to be in a state of shock and plainly unbalanced. At this stage, the crowd tried to surge forward, but the police held them back. The heart-rending cries of some of the hysterical survivors and their relieved relatives rent the air as they sobbed for the loved ones they had lost. And throughout it all, the Sisters of Mercy were desperately trying to reunite them with any relatives that were waiting for them, which was no easy job with such a huge crowd. Reporters were baying for news, and flashlights regularly lit up the sorry procession of survivors as they made their way down to the pier. Finally, it was Flora's turn, and as she hesitated at the top of the gangplank, gazing down at the sea of solemn faces below, she took a deep gulp of the foggy night air. It was time to begin living the lie. What would become of her if she didn't? Chapter 11. Name, child? A kindly nun asked Flora as she finally stepped onto dry land. There had been times when she was adrift in the lifeboat that she had been convinced she was going to die, and now that she was there, she felt overcome with emotion as she thought of all the people who had perished in the freezing sea. It's Constance Ogilvy. Flora's legs had suddenly turned to jelly as the woman put her arm about her waist and led her across the pier. The rain was bouncing off the cobbles, and in minutes Flora was chilled to the bone. Each of the people waiting for a loved one had been separated into alphabetical groups to make it a little easier, and the nun paused in front of one such group and called, "Constance Ogilvy?" Flora kept her eyes on the crowd and watched transfixed as it parted, and a woman in a plain but smart outfit, accompanied by a man in a dark coat and hat, hurried towards her. "Oh, Constance, my poor girl, what you must have gone through," the woman cried, as tears sparkled on her cheeks. "But come along, we need to get you home and into something warm. Help her, please, Thomas." The man instantly stepped forward, and before she knew it, he had swept Flora up into his arms as if she weighed no more than a feather, and was striding back towards a waiting automobile, with the woman hurrying along behind him. He settled Flora onto the back seat and tucked a warm blanket about her knees. Then, nodding to the woman as she climbed in beside her, he asked, "Straight home, ma'am?" "Oh yes, please, Thomas," the woman answered, as she tucked the blanket even more tightly about Flora. "And as fast as you can, if you please." She turned back to Flora and told her, "This is not quite the welcome I'd envisaged for you, my dear. It must have been awful. But anyway, as you've probably realised, I am your Aunt Alexandra, although I'm quite happy for you to call me Aunt Alex." My father always called me Connie," Flora muttered, and was glad of the darkness that hid the colour that she felt flooding into her cheeks. This wasn't going to be as easy as she had thought, and just for a moment she was tempted to tell the truth. "Then Connie it is," the woman said gently, taking her hand and squeezing it. "And I can't tell you how happy I am to have you here. I just thank God that you survived." The woman seemed so sincere that the moment for telling the truth was gone, and Flora knew then that she would have to go on with the lie. What alternative did she have? The car was moving now, and soon they were passing buildings that seemed to stretch right up into the sky. And there were so many lights everywhere she looked. Even the sky above the buildings seemed bright. She had thought London was a busy place, but it was nothing compared to here. There was so much traffic and so many shops that she hardly knew where to look first. And people, so many people of all nationalities. The cold air had made her start to cough again, and she was aware that Alex was watching her with a concerned look on her face, although she said little. When she had the opportunity, Flora peeped at her from the corner of her eye and thought how pretty she was. She looked like a younger version of Connie's mother from what she had seen in her pictures, but then she supposed she would. They had been sisters. She had the same fair hair and deep blue eyes, and she was tall and slim. Flora estimated she must be somewhere in her late 30s to early 40s, but she was still a very attractive woman, and she seemed to be very kind, which was going to make Flora's deception all the harder. But then, she reasoned, she had been no blood relation to Connie. Connie had always known that she had been adopted at a few days old, so surely there could have been no bond between them. And she was sure that Connie had said that she couldn't even remember her, for she hadn't visited them since she was just a baby. Leaning her head back against the seat, she closed her eyes. The next thing she knew, someone was gently shaking her arm, and she realized to her surprise that she must have fallen asleep. "Wake up, darling, we're home." Flora opened her eyes to find Alex leaning over her, but then Thomas opened the car door and lifted her out, and she was carried into the house. The entrance hall was beautiful, but she didn't have long to study it, for Thomas was carrying her up a sweeping carved mahogany staircase that ended in a galleried landing. She was carried into a room with a 4-poster bed standing against one wall, where a young maid was waiting for her.
"I've run you a nice hot bath, miss," she said respectfully, "and the mistress has laid some nightclothes out for you on the bed. We didn't think you'd have any of your own after... well, anyway, would you like some help?"
"No, I can manage, thank you," Flora croaked, as another bout of coughing made her red in the face. Alex had joined them by then, and she led her towards a pretty chair with gilt legs. "Run and fetch some hot chicken soup," she instructed the maid. Then, turning her attention back to Flora, she told her, "I have a doctor downstairs waiting to examine you when you've had your bath, dear. I'm sure he'll be able to give you something for that awful cough, and when you're ready, the bathroom is through that door there. But take your time." "Are you quite sure that you can manage on your own? Young Patsy, who you just met, will be your maid from now on, so anything at all you need, just ask her. When you're well again, we'll take you shopping for some lovely new clothes. That will be nice, won't it? Shopping together, I mean. I'm sure we're going to have so much fun, although I was so sorry to hear about your father's passing. He was a truly lovely man." "Yes, he was," Flora croaked, feeling more uncomfortable by the minute. Alex was so nice, she felt even worse about deceiving her now. But what alternative do I have? She asked herself, as she stretched out in a bath full of warm, soapy water minutes later. Alex was being kind to her because she believed she was her niece, but if she was to discover that she was only a maid, she might turn her out into the street. Flora shuddered at the prospect as she tried to put her confused thoughts into some sort of order. And how would Connie's uncle accept her? She remembered Connie telling her that he was much older than her aunt. But she supposed she would find out soon enough. So for now, she gave herself up to the pleasure of a long, leisurely soak as she tried to block the terrible images of Connie tumbling into the sea. Once she was dry and had slipped into the nightclothes that had been laid out for her, the young maid came back carrying a tray with a pot of tea and a dish of hot soup on it.
"The mistress says you're to try and eat this, miss," she told Flora. "And when you're done, the doctor will come in to see you."
The girl placed the tray on a table next to the window. The heavy velvet drapes were drawn tight shut against the cold night, and Flora sat down and tried to swallow some of the soup. Soon after, the doctor, a bald little man, who looked to be almost as round as he was high, appeared and gave her a thorough examination as Alex hovered nervously nearby.
Her chest is very tight, but then that's to be expected after being out in the freezing cold for so long. She's lucky it hasn't turned to pneumonia. And she's still quite shaky. Again, to be expected after what she's been through. But I'm sure careful nursing, nourishing food, and a few days' complete bed rest will sort that," he observed.
Alex breathed a sigh of relief. At least the doctor didn't seem to consider there was any permanent damage done. The doctor left her a bottle of foul-smelling medicine, then took his leave, as Alex fussed about her. "It's into bed for you, miss," she said kindly, as she led Flora to the bed and tucked the covers under her chin. "And there you'll stay until I'm quite sure you're fully recovered. Now, is there anything I can get for you?" "Perhaps some newspapers I could read," Flora said falteringly. Alex nodded and hurried away, and minutes later, Patsy reappeared with a pile of different newspapers. "I'm afraid they're all full of the disaster on the Titanic, miss. Are you sure it won't upset you reading them?" she asked worriedly. Flora shook her head, and once Patsy had gone again, she began to read down the list of the dead and missing people that had been identified so far. And soon she found what she was looking for.
Miss Flora Butler.
The name seemed to jump off the page as the enormity of what she was doing came home to her. How would her parents feel when they read this? It would break their hearts. It should be Connie's name there, not hers, but already the deception had gone much too far for her to turn back. On the next page, she found Connie's name amongst the list of survivors. Toby's name was there too. He must have been on the Carpathia as well, and she thanked God they hadn't seen each other, although it appeared the majority of people who had survived were women and children. She thought once more, then, of the tiny little soul who had frozen to death in her arms, and the tears came again. She knew that the memory of that poor dead baby would haunt her for many years to come. Finally, she wiped her eyes and laid the paper aside. What was done, and from this moment on, she would have to become Miss Constance Ogilvy. 5 days later, when Alex considered that Flora was well enough to get up for a while, she was allowed down into the drawing-room one morning, and there, for the first time, she met Connie's uncle and his spinster daughter, Margaret. Her aunt, which was now how Flora thought of her, had gone out of her way to make her feel welcome, but her husband and his daughter eyed her with contempt.
"So you're Constance, are you?"
Magnus Ward was a tall, well-made man with a shock of snow-white hair and grey eyes, and from the moment he set eyes on his guest, he made no attempt to make her feel welcome. His daughter, who looked to be in her mid to late 20s, was like a pale female version of him, and Flora wasn't at all surprised to learn that she was unmarried. She certainly wasn't the prettiest of women. She was very well built, and her face was angular. Her mousy brown hair was scraped back into an unbecoming bun on the back of her head, which did nothing to enhance her features, and her grey eyes were cold. Suddenly, in their presence, Alex became quiet and jittery, and Flora found herself feeling sorry for her. "Should she be allowed downstairs yet?" Margaret questioned her. "Oh, yes, dear. The doctor called in again yesterday and said that a couple of hours a day out of bed shouldn't hurt her now." Her aunt was wringing her hands, and Flora frowned. Why did she let them talk to her that way, she wondered. They were addressing her as if she was one of the servants. But she said nothing. It wasn't her place.
"So how long do you reckon you'll be staying?"
Magnus asked bluntly, and Flora flushed. Until I reach my 21st birthday, and then I can go home." Already, even she felt intimidated by the man. He really was extremely rude. He sniffed. Then, perching a pair of spectacles on his nose, he shook out the newspaper and began to read as if she wasn't even there, while Margaret sailed out of the room without so much as another glance at her. "Actually, I think perhaps I'd like to go back to my room, if you don't mind, Aunt." Suddenly, Flora felt so in the way she couldn't wait to get away from him. "Of course." Alex placed her arm about her shoulders and led her away, and as they were climbing the stairs, she whispered, "Don't mind your uncle. That's just his way. Margaret is the same. She is his daughter by his first marriage. His first wife died." "I see." Flora could only imagine what a horrible life Alex must have had with him, but she kept her thoughts to herself, and once she was back in her room, she sighed with relief. From now on, she would avoid both Magnus and his daughter whenever she could. But he had highlighted one problem that hadn't occurred to her before. He had asked when she would be going home. But how could she now? Mary was there taking care of the house, and there was no way she could pass herself off as Constance to her. What was she to do? Chapter 12. Some days later, Alex summoned her dressmaker to the house to measure Flora and to let her look through some dress patterns. "She'll just make you a couple of outfits to wear for now," Alex told her. "And then when you're properly well, we'll go on that shopping spree I promised you." Flora's terrible cough had hung on persistently, and although she was now much better than she had been, she was still not fully recovered, and she was suffering from terrible nightmares in which she could hear the screams of the dying and see Connie plunging to her death. She would feel the tiny body of the baby who had died in her arms, and would wake up in a cold sweat and a tangle of damp bedclothes. Alex had nursed her devotedly, and already Flora was more than a little fond of her. She was such a sweet, gentle woman, and it was hard to imagine her married to someone like Magnus, who was so stern and cold. "Would you mind very much if I addressed you as Alex rather than Aunt Alex?" she tentatively asked one day. "It's just that we don't know each other well, and—" "That would be quite all right," Alex assured her with a gentle smile. "Once we get to know each other a little more, you'll start to feel better about things. It's bound to take you a while to get over what happened and get used to living with strange people in a strange house." "Alex seems to be a very kind person," Flora remarked to Patsy later that day as the girl was brushing her hair for her. Being waited on was still taking some getting used to. "She is," Patsy answered. "But the master can be, a little brusque." "I know exactly what you mean." Flora nodded in agreement. "And I didn't even know he had a daughter by a previous marriage until I got here. She's a little abrupt too, isn't she?" "Yeah, she is." Patsy piled Flora's hair onto the top of her head and started to secure it with pins. She paused as if she was wondering how much she should say, but then she went on. "She can be a bit of a tartar. She was engaged to be married some years ago, apparently. Rumour had it that he was only marrying her for her money, but then he met some other young lady who was just as rich, but shall we say, a little better looking? Miss Margaret isn't the prettiest of women, is she? Anyway, he broke off the engagement, and they reckon she's been difficult to live with ever since. I feel right sorry for the poor mistress sometimes. Those two rule her with a rod of iron, and she can't seem to do a thing right. Between you and me, I don't know why she doesn't just clear off and leave them both to it. Anyone with half an eye can see that she isn't happy, but I suppose she must love him, and he is very wealthy. He owns a huge fleet of ships that sail all over the world, both passenger and cargo." She stopped abruptly then, concerned that she had said too much, but Flora smiled at her encouragingly. "Don't worry, I shan't repeat anything you've told me," she promised. Once she was dressed, Patsy left the room to get on with her other duties, and Flora stood at the window staring thoughtfully out into the street below. Poor Alex. She had been right in her assumption that she wasn't happy. But why did she stay then? She wondered. She didn't seem like the sort of woman who would stay with a man simply because he was rich. Whatever the reason, she had already decided that the couple were completely unsuited. Today, she was wearing one of the day dresses that Alex's dressmaker had had delivered to her the day before, and so she decided to go downstairs to see if she could find something to read. She was getting rather bored of staying in her bedroom now. Luckily, at the bottom of the stairs, she bumped into Alex, who had been on her way upstairs to check on her. "Why, I do believe you're looking a little better today, dear," she said with a relieved smile. "I do feel better, and was wondering if you had any books or anything I might read. I've read all the magazines you sent up to me." Flora had stopped reading the newspapers. They were still full of the news about the Titanic, and she found them depressing. At that moment, Margaret appeared from the door of the drawing-room, and she eyed Flora with open disdain. "Oh, you're up and about then," she commented, rather unnecessarily. "Yes, I was on the hunt for something to read." "Come with me," Alex said quickly, before Margaret could say any more, and, taking Flora's arm, she led her quickly away to a room just a little further down the hallway. "This is my own private little sitting room," she told her, as Flora looked around. It was a comfy room with heavy navy blue velvet curtains at the windows, which complemented the soft, light grey paint of the walls. Antiques were dotted about here and there, but there was nothing pretentious about it. "There's a bookshelf over there." Alex pointed to a corner of the room. "Do help yourself to whatever takes your fancy, and feel free to use this room whenever you wish. No one else comes in here apart from me and the maid who cleans it." Flora found this rather strange. But then, on the few occasions she had been in their company, neither Magnus nor his daughter had even attempted to include Alex in their conversations, so it was no wonder that she preferred her own company. Today, Alex was dressed in a simple dove-grey day dress. That was another thing that Flora had noticed about her. She always tended to dress in quite plain, dull-coloured clothes, and yet, if her husband was as wealthy as Patsy said he was, surely she could have afforded to dress more fashionably. Crossing to the bookshelves, she began to leaf through the books, as Alex ordered morning coffee, and when they were both seated, her aunt asked, "When do you think you'll feel well enough to go shopping? I'm aware that you must desperately want to get some more clothes of your own, but I don't want you to venture out until you're quite sure that you feel up to it." "Perhaps we could go tomorrow," Flora suggested hopefully. "We could always come back if I get tired." Alex's face lit up like a child's at the thought of the shopping trip ahead. "We'll do that then," she said excitedly. "And I think we'll start off in Macy's. We'll probably be able to get almost everything you need there. It's absolutely huge, and I'm sure you'll love it. We'll open you an account there. Mr. Wainthrop has already deposited quite a large sum of money in a bank for you, and he will be paying your allowance into it each month. Speaking of which, I almost forgot. I received a letter from him this morning inquiring after you. He informs me that as well as being your father's solicitor, he and his late wife were also close family friends, and he's most anxious about you. He enclosed a letter for you too. I'll get it now." As she hurried across to a small escritoire in the corner of the room, Flora's heart began to thump as the enormity of the deception she had embarked upon hit her afresh. Alex handed her an envelope then, and Flora opened it with shaking hands and began to read.
"My dear Connie, I cannot begin to tell you how concerned and distressed I was when I received the news of the Titanic sinking, and what relief I felt when I discovered that your name was on the list of survivors. I must offer sincere condolences for the loss of your maid, Flora. I know that you were close, and her death must have been a great blow to you, poor girl, especially so soon after the loss of your father. She was a dear girl, and will be sadly missed by all that knew her, especially her family, who I believe are deeply mourning her. Can you begin to imagine how guilty I feel? It was I who booked your passage, believing that it would be a trip of a lifetime for you both. I can only extend my heartfelt apologies, but who would have believed what happened after the ship had been declared unsinkable? Anyway, my dear girl, I have been to see Mrs. Merry, who, like myself, is grateful that you are alive and well. Would it help if I were to come and visit you? It would be no inconvenience whatsoever if seeing a familiar face would help you. With very best wishes, Victor Wainthrop."
Panic threatened to choke her for a moment, but aware that Alex was watching her closely, she said shakily, "I must write to him immediately. Mr. Wainthrop was almost like an uncle to me. He and his wife regularly came to dinner with me and my father before she passed away, and he and father used to play golf together. He's known me since I was a baby, so he's feeling very bad because it was he that booked the passage on the ship for me and Flora. I just need to let him know as soon as possible that I am well again. I also need to go to the bank and arrange for some money to be sent to Flora's family. She gave them some of her wages each month, you see." She ended falteringly as tears welled and streamed down her pale cheeks. Only now did it hit home to her how bereft her family must be feeling. And also she was terrified that Mr. Wainthrop might take it into his head to visit. were he to do that, she would be found out in her lie.
Of course, you must write to him, Alex told her sympathetically, as she saw how distressed she was. You'll find everything you need in my desk. Please, just help yourself, and when you finish, give it to me, and I'll get Thomas to post it immediately for you.
Thank you.
Alex left her then, and Flora hastily sat down to reply to Mr. Wainthropp's letter. For a long time she sat staring blankly at the sheet of paper, wondering what she should write, and eventually she began.
Dear Mr. Wainthropp, thank you for your letter. I am pleased to inform you that I am now much better, and I assure you that there is absolutely no need for you to make the long journey here to see me. Of course, I am still grieving for Flora, and would be grateful if you could pass on my condolences to her family and ensure that some money amounting to Flora's wages could be forwarded to them each month. It seems the least I can do under the circumstances. Please also forward my best wishes to Mrs. Merry and assure her that I am recovering, and please do not feel any guilt for what has happened. You thought you were doing us a kindness when you booked our passage, and you were only following my father's wishes. Who could have foreseen what was going to happen? I shall write again in due course. Yours sincerely, Constance Ogilvy.
Thankfully, she had seen Connie's handwriting dozens of times, so it was quite easy to imitate, and if it did look a little shaky, hopefully he would think it was because she was still not quite herself following her ordeal. She silently blessed Connie for all the hours she had spent helping her to improve her reading and writing. But then she felt even more guilty. How would Connie feel knowing that her friend was using her lessons to deceive everyone? She'd be disgusted with her, and rightly so. It was only when she came to put the letter into the envelope that she realized that she had no idea where to send it. Then she spotted the letter he had sent to Alex, which had his address on, so she carefully wrote it on the envelope and sealed it. True to her word, Alex dispatched Thomas immediately to post it, and suddenly feeling worn out and emotionally drained, Flora went back to her room to rest until lunchtime. It had been arranged that Flora and Alex would eat in the dining room that day, and when Flora came downstairs, she found Margaret and Alex already there. She saw at a glance that Margaret had taken her place at one end of the table, which she thought was rather strange. Magnus sat at the other end when he was there, which she was pleased to see he wasn't, but surely as his wife, Alex should have sat in Margaret's seat. "You're 5 minutes late," Margaret snapped shortly as a maid began to carry the meal in. "Magnus has gone to see his manager at the shipping office," Alex cut in hastily before Flora could retort. "He's quite happy to sit back and let others run the company these days, but he still likes to go in and check the books, and that all is running smoothly from time to time." She smoothed a snow-white linen napkin across her lap as Flora sat down, and the maid began to spoon soup into their dishes from a gleaming silver tureen. "As you've probably gathered, we like to have a fairly light meal at lunchtime, soups, cheeses, salads and such, and then we have our main meal in the evening." "I think she's been here quite long enough to know that," Margaret said sarcastically as she lifted her spoon and began to eat. Flora flushed and wondered why Alex didn't retaliate. How could she let her stepdaughter speak to her like that? Even the servants shouldn't be addressed that way as far as Flora was concerned. Surely everyone deserved respect. But then she knew it was none of her business at the end of the day, so she lifted her spoon and began to eat. Margaret really was one of the rudest people she had ever met.
End of CD 3.